Our first question today is from Noah Evans. He writes, "Hey Keegan, much love and thanks for all you do. I've recently been wrestling with the thought that in the grand analysis, Nietzsche might not have seen anything as life-denying, or rather that everything is ultimately life-affirming. In The Gay Science, he mentions that anything that could have harmed life probably died out eons ago. I'm pretty sure that was the gist of it. I'm going based off memory. And in genealogy, the ascetic types are still shown to be the subject of the will to power, which seems to be the common rule of life in the Nietzschean sense. You know, the condemners of life say beware, all the while still commanding to be. And those values which are ostensibly anti-life, are they not necessarily just values of life that lie about their origin, presupposing, of course, that there is nothing beyond the apparent world? Wouldn't this all make life affirmation a description and not prescriptions, which is far more useful for one who wants to affirm life like the man himself? Doesn't that make amor fati kind of descriptive for him too, that him valuing life affirmation and there being nothing but, then he must love his fate? Am I going crazy trying to systematize Nietzsche into the, put in layman's terms, most positive thinker yet? And if so, why treat it like a war between life denial and life affirmation, and why position himself on the side of the explicitly life-affirming in lieu of the clandestinely life-affirming? Is it just some inevitability of his fate? By the way, I understand that life denial preserves a weakened and decrepit form of life, but it is by the weak that the strong can exit in the first place. I'm guessing you meant exist. And thus again, in the final grand scheme, it does seem to be life affirmation by and by. As always, sorry for any incoherencies. Also curious about your thoughts on hip-hop/rap and your favorite albums and artists from the genres, if you have any." Okay, we'll address the first question. So, what you say is correct. In The Gay Science, he does essentially say that what could have harmed the species must have died off eons ago. It's kind of a speculative point, but in context, he's talking about the fact that the so-called evil men advance the species just as much as the good herd type of man. The criminal, the Napoleon, the barbarian, the Cesare Borgia, all of these types, Nietzsche says, have done just as much to advance the species. My way of fast-tracking this argument on the podcast has been that they, in a way, keep us from atrophying, right? That if you have the cunning and the ingenuity of the criminal, then it drives the similar sort of cunning and ingenuity in the detective. And if you have figures like Napoleon who are going to test your republic and its constitution and its norms, in a way that, again, it's a test. It might be a way of ultimately strengthening the state and its institutions and norms and all of these things. That, it's essentially the fundamental Nietzschean point that it's not, we don't grow and self-overcome in absentia of conflict and pain and difficulties. That, in fact, introducing all of these things are what advances the species, quote unquote. And, also in The Gay Science, he has that passage that I love where he says, "For him in whom the highest feeling consists of rest, let him repose. And in whom the highest feeling consists of, great deeds and exploration, let him go explore." I forget exactly all the, I should have probably gone and looked up the passage, but I'm sure most of you will know the one that I mean, that he essentially says, find whatever gives you the highest feeling and pursue that. Life should be a series of experiments, all of the difference and multiplicity. It's sort of a return to polytheism, and he has that passage in The Gay Science where he explicitly says that monotheism creates this kind of stultifying complacency. It prevents the revaluations of values from freely being able to occur, whereas polytheistic systems are more dynamic, that new gods can be introduced, and this can allow for a sort of more free contest between values versus locking everything into this singular monotheistic conception of the world in which the revaluation becomes impossible. Or rather, at the very least, it only becomes possible once that the values upon which that monotheistic worldview was based, in this case Christianity, finally becomes so sick and weakened that we can't even believe in them anymore, in which case a revaluation of values will become necessary. It will become inevitable in a sense. And you're also correct to say that the will to power is a rule of life. I mean, the priest is, what do you say, a subject of the will to power? I mean, we are all subjects of the will to power. In a way, you could say, I mean, Nietzsche even goes so far as to say that you are nothing but will to power and nothing besides. Because again, even the shape of our bodies, even the organs we have, even the way that we perceive the world, all of our mental equipment, body and mind, what precedes all of these things are impulses. There were impulses even in the most rudimentary forms of bodies. If we go all the way back to like amoebas or protozoans of some type that are the universal ancestor of all life, that's obviously we have a far more sophisticated body now. How does that grow? Well, impulse was the driving thing that was producing all of these changes and evolutions in the shapes of bodies. And what is impulse? It's drive. It's this process which is established by a relation where you have the impulse and the object of the impulse, or the thing which blocks the impulse which it must overcome. These relations of tension, essentially, in which each drive wishes to overcome all resistances to itself. And so, on the most fundamental of levels, we are will to power. Everything is will to power. Now, but what you're pointing to then is from within that, I would say, the highest perspective at which Nietzsche really speaks of will to power. How can we really say that anything then is life-denying? If nothing can harm the species, how can we say that even the life-denying values of Christianity have harmed the species? And in fact, I mean, there's even, like the preface of Beyond Good and Evil, many other passages, some in We Philologists. There are many passages where Nietzsche sort of hints at, or even sort of explicitly articulates this idea that the tension, the inner tension created by Christianity can be turned into an incredibly useful thing, that even that could have just been a test of ourselves as a species, of the organism with consciousness, right? In a way, Christianity is the ultimate test of consciousness and whether it can be a worthwhile development in the total economy of life. Because if Christianity is to define the content of consciousness, in a way, you could say it might be a mistake in the total economy of life. That it might end up being the one thing that ends up harming the species or leading to the end of the species. And why would that be? Is it just because it's preserving weakness? Well, Nietzsche sometimes speaks in that language, but I think what's more important is that the priest's particular form of the will to power actually produces more weakness. It's a vicious circle of producing world weariness, effectively. The priest takes all of the energy, the ascetic ideal takes all of the energy that we might be devoting to self-overcoming, and essentially cuts off all routes to self-overcoming other than the ascetic ideal itself, right? The idea of mastering the passions, overcoming the animal world, truly overcoming the drives by essentially starving them out, torturing them, directing all of your that energy, the potential energy that you have, that's effectively, we might say in a very real sense, is the will to power, is drive, and turning it back on itself so that it exhausts itself and effectively orients your eye, your vision, your consciousness all the more towards this abstract world which exists in the consciousness but not in the physiological reality. So I think the way to kind of go through Nietzsche's dilemma here, is everything ultimately will to power? Is everything ultimately then in some way life-affirming? Oh, another element you talked about was, Christianity, the ascetic ideal. It says to life, beware, but while still commanding us to be. It was a will to nothingness because we would rather will the void than be devoid of will. There are various ways of translating that last line of the genealogy, essay 1. But also, I believe I brought this up in my conversation with, I don't remember who I was talking to when I brought this up recently, but the whole notion of Socrates and this theoretical way of life, and the idea that the choice was between perish or become absurdly rational. Everything has become questionable in our values in society. Socrates provides a new myth, this myth of rational happiness, we might say. Wisdom equals virtue equals happiness. This sort of empirical, questioning, logicizing, theoretical approach to life that is ultimately, in Nietzsche's view, quote-unquote, life-denying in a very important sense, or it leads to a life-denying conclusion, because he says, of course, it has the sort of the outward appearance of being optimistic, and yet in his second preface to Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche goes back in 1886 and says that optimism is a mask for pessimism. Is that the great irony of Socrates? Is that beneath it all, he was ultimately a pessimist. He ultimately didn't think life was good. Because, of course, there's so much of the ideal in Socrates and Plato, the ideal way to live, the good life, the ideal republic, the ideal political situation, all the ideal forms of things, right? And the world of sights and sounds is somewhat dissatisfactory, and the normal way of viewing the world and operating within the world is dissatisfactory and subpar. And virtue and self-knowledge are, in fact, incredibly rare things. Socrates says he's only wise because he's aware of his ignorance, whereas everyone else is so ignorant that they're not even aware of that. And so basically all of the sort of the optimism of Socrates, Nietzsche reads as, in a way, perhaps a self-aware myth that he was providing, that he knew didn't really map onto reality, and at the end of the day, it ends up being pessimistic then, because it's a condemnation of reality. But was that still what was needed? There's a passage in Birth of Tragedy where he's like, it might have been the choice between adopting Socratic rationalism and strangling your loved ones, your spouse, and your children as society around you descends into chaos and anarchy and is destroyed by the barbarians, and you're all killing yourself so you can have a slightly better death or something like that. That might have been the choice. Meaning, he's putting it in those stark terms because he's essentially saying that might have been the fuel that kept the Greek society going and prevented that outcome. So is that life-affirming? Well, in a sense it is, in a sense it isn't. It's sort of like, I think it was when I was speaking to the living philosophy. It's like taking a little bit of poison. Socratism is a little bit of poison that could have been medicinal at that time. Even Christianity is a bit of poison that was probably medicinal for the Roman slave, the person who's totally subjugated and at the bottom of the social hierarchy and has basically been made into an object. The otherworldism of Christianity is a pretty potent poison that could be medicinal for that person. The problem is that we've kept taking the poison, and we've idealized that cure that might have been appropriate in a specific time. Again, man is this experiment of nature, this experimental animal. That was one way to live that might have been necessitated by the circumstances, but the experiment we're now running is with just treating the poison in and of itself, regardless of the circumstances, as a good thing to take, and taking more and more of it. That's the vicious circle of self-exhaustion that the priest is. That's the road that the priest leads the human species down. And Nietzsche, therefore, creates the Overman and the Last Man allegories to show us these two paths, these two movements for the human race. What direction are we moving in? And so, for me, the easy through line is this. It becomes really clear and concrete when we anchor this to physiological terms of health and sickness. The ascetic ideal was a ultimately sick approach to life that might have been the best option in certain circumstances. And ultimately, what does Nietzsche talk about? A great deal on his own personal level, but he extrapolates this into a whole metaphor. Convalescence, right? Overcoming his own sickness. He feels he's stronger for having overcome his own illness. That which does not kill me makes me stronger, of course, right? One of the most famous Nietzsche quotes. But does that mean that health isn't health and sickness isn't sickness? No, sickness is still sickness, right? Your enemy, you could be grateful for your enemy, right? You could be grateful that, if we didn't have these barbarian raids at the frontiers of Rome, then it wouldn't have strengthened us for all of these military campaigns that we're now undertaking in the future. And that maybe we can draw a through line there. But that doesn't mean that you should say, well, we should just open up the borders and let barbarians raid us, right? Because if you let that happen too much, if you're not able to overcome the sickness, then it will kill you. So sickness can be a very useful thing. It can be turned into a life-affirming thing. But it's not in and of itself. It shouldn't be mistaken for health. This is why Nietzsche is trying to assign this new valuation to truth claims, to moralities themselves. Are they healthy or sick? In which direction are they leading us? Is it towards the Overman or to the Last Man? I don't want to imply that that's it puts everything back into a simple moral formula, because again, with the experimental character of life and of mankind, with it being this animal with consciousness within life, there are so many possibilities. And in some sense, Nietzsche's saying the way to the overman is to open up all the possibilities, live your experimental way of life, see where it leads you. That is going to sort of facilitate or make possible the advancement of the species in a way that locking ourselves into one form of worldview, one way of life, one morality, and that it just so happens to be a sickening, weakening, exhausting morality, in the long grand scheme of things, that might actually lead to the decline of the species, or if not their decline. I mean, Nietzsche, he famously disagrees with Darwin, right? And he says that the idea that the species becomes fitter and stronger is not actually borne out by evolution, that in fact what we see is that the individuals of a species become more they become more instrumentalized. They become more like carbon copies of one another, like ants or something, a species like that, right? And those are incredibly efficient species. They're very survivable, but it doesn't lead to the fitness or the strength or to like more complicated, more sophisticated, more powerful forms of life necessarily. It leads to more powerful species, but more powerful for what? For this process of just becoming, supremely good at preserving themselves on the herd level, right? Or on the hive level or the swarm level. And that's the end that Nietzsche doesn't want to see for mankind. He sees that as a squandering of our consciousness, of the distinct things about us. Is that an irrational value judgment? Because on the one level, you could just say, whatever happens, happens, right? It's all fate. It's all nature is a squanderer, perhaps mankind and our particular quality of being the thinking animal, the rational animal. Maybe that will all be squandered. And that's fine in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't matter, right? But Nietzsche is invested. He does want this overman future for the human race instead, where we don't just become these great ant organizations, where we actually have, continue to have new experiments, new extraordinary, just risks taken with ways of living and all of these things. And so I think really the problem you're pointing to, the real dilemma is not distinguishing between health and sickness, right? It's like whether or not you should take a side on that in the battle for health against sickness, whether or not you should adopt the stance that it actually matters whether you're not, you articulate an argument for the sake of health or try to turn that into a new moral code, reevaluate the value system, because ultimately there is that other side of Nietzsche that, when Zarathustra lays down at noon and says, at this moment, everything is perfect. I want nothing to be different, nothing forward, nothing backward. That is amor fati, right? Everything, I bless the whole world. It's all fine, whatever happens. And so, yeah, that might be a true contradiction. That's what I see Klosowski struggling with. When we get on to the material about Bataille struggles with this as well. He sees it as a contradiction in Nietzsche. I can't really square that circle for you. It's sort of like, Nietzsche's philosophy shows you the relativity of all values. Can you then assert your own moral ends, even on the grand scale of the human species? Can you be that confident enough in your legislation to say, yes, all of my values are relative, a mere confession of my impulse. Nevertheless, this is my vision for the future of mankind that I wish to legislate. That would be a pretty audacious thing to do. And it's sort of, it's what Nietzsche's philosophy demands of us. As far as rap and hip hop, I'm not like an expert in it. I try to be cultured and knowledgeable about many forms of music, and I have found some artists that I enjoy. I got really into Tribe Called Quest when I was younger, and then Del the Funky Homo Sapien. That was mainly through Deltron 3030, but then I saw Del perform live, and that was pretty cool. He did material from all sorts of different eras. Bone Thugs and Harmony. See, it's all dad rap, right? It's what the kids would be saying about my recommendations. I guess newer rap, I did like Logic for a little bit. I did like Sade Villain, the collaboration with MF Doom and Sade. There, that I guess it was just like a, God, what do you call it? I'm like losing the word here. Mashup. I guess it was mashups. But he got permission from her and all that. And they're not really rap, but there's a R&B, I guess. Like, I don't know how they self-describe, but to me, it's like this is in many ways like classic R&B, but just they're great singers. There's a band called 53 Thieves that's pretty cool. That I think most people who like rap would be into. They've collaborated with some rappers as well, and two of them live here in Austin. So, and I've seen them perform as well. But other than that, I mean, those are my favorites. I mean, there's some more I could list off, but that's basically it. Some of my bandmates are more into like newer rap and are more ear to the ground with what's going on there. But thank you for the question, Noah. Let's go on to Plintigaf. He writes, "Hi Keegan, have you considered Merleau-Ponty at all or any Nietzsche-like positions in the philosophy of mind, such as embodied mind? Merleau-Ponty has an example of the subject reinterpreted as body through the experience of touching your own hands. If you reach out with your right hand and touch your left, you can feel your right hand as subject and your left hand as object. But you can also reverse the relationship and perceive your left hand as subject and your right hand as object. The ordinary split between subject and object turns them into positive realities that have no essential relation to each other, and the relationship between them cannot be reversed. It would not make sense for the same entities, such as the mind, to be subject at one time and object at another, so says the traditional subject-object schema. Similarly, it would not make much sense for the object to suddenly transform into the subject. Merleau-Ponty thinks that the reversibility of the body allows us to radically reconceive the nature of the subject and object, so that if reversibility is possible, they cannot be entirely distinct ontological types or categories. He also thinks that this means the world can no longer be conceived as a pure object, but is rather the ground of both subject and object and is prior to both. The subject-object split is not then a split between two radically different modes of being, but is simply a split that opens up between the sensing and the sensible within the body itself. It is the same hand that is both touching and touched, though they can never coincide and be both touching and touched at the same time." Well, I would take issue with that, but I'll finish the question here. "A point I find particularly worthwhile in Merleau-Ponty's account is that what is needed is to ascertain precisely what the being of the world means, and Descartes, for example, assumed that he already knew what existence meant, and what it meant to say that the world exists. For him, that meant in the form of extension, which is quite dubious to say the least. Do you have a position of your own, and if so, what has provided the best arguments in your view, such as specific books, articles, experiments, etc.? Thanks for all the work you've done." Do I have a position of my own on the subject-object split, or philosophy of mind, I guess, more generally? I really can't say that I've developed a coherent theory of philosophy of mind. I mean, so a lot of what you describe is Merleau-Ponty's opinion, and I have not read any of his work. I'm not really familiar with him. It's one of those names that I see often bandied about, but I have no experience with him at all, assuming it is a him. I think it's a him. But much of what you describe really reminds me of what Schopenhauer puts in a much more, we might say, metaphysical way when he's describing the way in which we can know that the self is both will and representation. And that, that essentially when we talk about the subjectivity, the interiority, right, it's, for Schopenhauer, fundamentally will. Now, of course, the mind, driven by this will, then represents the world, and we represent ourselves, and in that we see this world of apparently objects. But Schopenhauer would insist, as apparently Merleau-Ponty would, that there is, what exactly, I'm looking for where he says it in the question, where he says that there must be something prior to the subject-object schema that is the foundation of it. That the world is the ground of both subject and object and is prior to both. And you essentially bring in, I guess Descartes would be an example of someone who sees the world, quote unquote, purely in terms of extended bodies, and he sees the subject purely in terms of mind, and therefore thinks it is rigorously conceivable to conceive of disembodied minds, or a mind that could exist where in a world that's fundamentally just an illusion, So Descartes' view of the mind is totally disembodied. In the episode I did on Descartes, that is a point that I think is of supreme importance in approaching Descartes. That there is this, there's this notion that Descartes was part of these Enlightenment philosophers that overcame Christian dogmatism or whatever. That thought begins to sort of open up and become more free and less bound to theology. And Descartes is traditionally one of the first figures, along with Bacon and Hobbes and a little bit later Locke, for example. None of these figures knew that they were starting an enlightenment. They didn't know anything about that. None of them use words like that. And when you look at Descartes' presuppositions, in a sense, it's just shot through with Christian thinking. Like, it's incredibly Christian. Like the Christian theology is simply argued for by Descartes in secular philosophical language. And he says in the preface to the faculty at Sorbonne, the entire reason for doing this is because, and this might just be a sort of rhetorical defense of what he's doing, but he says that we can't simply appeal to Scripture when arguing with the infidel because they'll accuse us of reasoning in a circle, and rightly so, we might add. But in any case, I find Descartes' work to be, just incredibly rooted in Christian thinking, and part of that is this division between the soul and the physical body. And, this physical world is a thing that's impermanent and is going to fall away, crumble away, eventually be burned away by fire in the final judgment. But there's like another eternal world. Perhaps our spirit will have an eternal body. I think that's the classic doctrine, right? In heaven, you'll get an eternal and perfect body. But as far as in this world, mind and body are separable if the mind is identical with the soul, which for Descartes it basically is. And so that produces what is traditionally known in this context as the Cartesian dualism. And Spinoza, that's one of the things he's responding to in Descartes. Bruno, to some extent, as well. But there's a theory of mind there that subject and object become these separable things, these distinct categories. And I think many people implicitly think in those terms, even if they wouldn't hold to all of the specific points in Descartes' arguments. It's no wonder that one of Descartes' enduring contributions to philosophy, right, his aphorism, "I think, therefore I am," is still quoted today. That's one of the things you can generally count on most normies to know about philosophy, right? What is Descartes famous for? "I think, therefore I am," right? Maybe not everyone will know that, but most people, it's a pretty common, that's pretty common knowledge, right? And "I think, therefore I am," what is that? That's a statement that one's existence can be assured because one is assured of the existence of one's mind or one's consciousness, one's subjectivity. The objects can't be taken for granted in the same way that the mind that thinks can be taken for granted. And so it's like this establishment of existence on the basis of mind separable from body. And people think, I was even kind of taught this way in my philosophy classroom, and in multiple philosophy classrooms, actually, where professors would put forward this idea that Descartes probably didn't really even believe in God, or who knows what he believed. He might have been a deist. He wasn't really a Christian. They have all this speculation about the fact that he's just appropriating these arguments from St. Anselm to prove the existence of God, and therefore square the circle of proving the existence of the world. And to me, I'm like, no, it seems like the entire philosophical effort in the Meditations is Christian through and through. The cogito is exactly as Christian as the ontological argument that he uses at the end of the Meditations. And the mind-body dualism doesn't really come up until the latter part of the Meditations. But it's one of the most important things for understanding Descartes, and I think it's, the fact that people are still quoting "I think, therefore I am" shows, without generally reading or attributing as much importance to the back 2/3 of the Meditations, it kind of shows. It's like we'll adopt the aphorism "I think, therefore I am," and not really consider, we're not really sensible of or conscious of all of the implications of that maxim for understanding ourselves as subject. And of course, Nietzsche gives his critique in Beyond Good and Evil, number 16, where he says the sentence, I think, contains a whole series of daring assertions, many of which might be impossible to prove, and that it relies on all sorts of things like being able to distinguish between thinking and feeling or thinking and willing and all of these things. Just these assumptions that are being made that we know what thinking is and can identify it, and that a thought implies the existence of a thinker, that the action implies the existence of a noun. That's one of the most common arguments that people will make, right? And Nietzsche is constantly reminding us that's just a grammatical rule. That's not a metaphysical rule. You're extrapolating a metaphysics out of grammar, right? Out of a grammatical convention. Wittgenstein again, comes to mind. Very glad we finally covered his work. But, that's interesting, the touching hands thing. I think it's like, well, the hand can't be the one that's both touching and touched. I mean, I think by definition they both are, right? If I clasp my hands together, I can have the experience that they are both touching and touched. I see what you mean, where you can sort of, depending on what your perspective is of this is the hand that I'm currently focusing on that's doing the touching, you can have a perception that that's the subject, the other hand is the object. But I'm touching my hand right now as I'm speaking, and it's like I am aware and the other hand is being touched. That's also a subjective experience. I don't know. It seems a little shaky to me. Maybe I would have to read Merleau-Ponty's work. I see what he's getting at. I ultimately agree with what he's getting at, that the subject-object split. It's just, again, I would maybe do an end around all of the philosophy of mind, and I just would see it as another grammatical convention maybe, or another just convention of the way that we speak about things in the world and our relation to them, and all of these things that, I mean, now, I don't know, people always get suspicious about this because then you have these like sort of pan-psychist ideas that we should see everything as part of the subject. In a very real way, that's true, right? Because what you see isn't the quote unquote the world. It's a world modeled for you by your nervous system and your organs. So literally everything you're seeing is yourself. So it is all subject, right? But does that mean some people then take this and we get to theories where the rocks outside are conscious, So I don't know about any of that. I think Schopenhauer would say they have like a very low, they're not like conscious or like sentient, but they're like a very low vibration or gradation of the will. So not fundamentally different from us in that sense, where we're all will. They're just like really like low gradations of it that aren't really, they're unable to really express their will in any other way than just sort of like holding a certain shape or something like that. But yeah, I guess in summary, I'll have to look into Merleau-Ponty. The next time I put up a suggestion for, a thread for suggestions for what's going to be in the next polls, go ahead and drop a Merleau-Ponty recommendation in there, please, if you'd like, and hopefully we'll eventually cover it. Next we have, and thank you, Plentygaff, thank you for the question. Next we have Matthew Spogue. Hi, Keegan. If you had to write a PhD about Nietzsche, what would you focus on, or would you be interested in a different philosophical topic? Love, from the Netherlands. Thank you. Is it Matthias? Matthews? Actually, because it's Dutch, I'm 100% sure I'm mispronouncing it. So I'm sorry for that. But Matt, as I will refer to you, if I had to write a PhD about Nietzsche, what would I focus on? Well, I did just give the lecture series earlier this year on Nietzsche's experiment with truth. And Nietzsche's view of truth is an incredibly interesting topic that I feel like I could write a pretty good dissertation on. Insofar as the conclusions I come to are perhaps not what the mainstream opinion about Nietzsche's view of truth is. Well, no, I don't know if I should put it like that. That might be a little bit misleading. I would say what I'm saying is ultimately backed up, well, not only by the primary sources, but also a lot of scholarship. It's just not the way that Nietzsche's view of truth is usually presented. And to sort of fast track the argument, it's that it's not that Nietzsche doesn't believe in truth or something like this, or that he's an irrationalist philosopher. He's actually, I would consider him, if he is a rationalist, he's irrationalist in a rationalist way. He arrives that way by a rationalist road. And that, in fact, Nietzsche is in many ways more similar to the rationalist traditions of epistemology than the empiricists. And skeptics like Hume, or people like Hume and Locke, Nietzsche has really important differences with them. It's just that his application of rationalism becomes kind of hyper-rational, where he has to question the value of rationality itself. And then his image of truth that he produces ends up being very different from the traditional images of truth. And that is the level at which I address the question, because ultimately truth, what is truth, right? Truth is a quality of statements or arguments. It's not a noun. It's not some thing that's out there. We could say it's an adjective, right? Is that true or not? Is this true is the real question. When we talk about truth as just sort of this abstract, there have been all these images that have been presented of truth. The Platonic image is the most important, because that's the one that Nietzsche directly combats. And in many ways, he takes Plato's image and inverts it. And there are many ways in which I agree with Heidegger on this, but there are also ways in which I think Heidegger sort of sells Nietzsche's inversion a bit short, and thinks that Nietzsche remains sort of, dare I say, like almost dialectically related to Plato by simply just flipping Platonism on its head. I kind of, in a way, in those lectures, am using an unholy alliance of both Deleuze and Heidegger, who famously, like Deleuze, writes his metaphysics in direct rebuke to Heidegger because he totally disagrees with him, right? But and I'm probably more in the Deleuzian camp in that respect. It's just Heidegger did have some valuable things to say in his lectures on Nietzsche that can kind of, I think, be brought into a strange kind of accord with Deleuze, even though their metaphysics are, well, again, from the outside they appear rather similar, but there are important differences between them. So it's very likely I would do something like maybe a more developed sort of thesis on that, right? About Nietzsche's view of truth. And the book that I've just written, I mean, maybe that could be submitted as a PhD thesis about Nietzsche's view of the Greeks, because that's like a comprehensive attempt to tackle basically every single aspect of Nietzsche's view, his comments on the Greeks. There are very few passages on the Greeks by Nietzsche, or on individual Greek writers or figures, that are not discussed in the book. Almost every single thing Nietzsche says about the Greeks is discussed in the book, and there's a fair deal of interpretation and interpolation even on top of that I've added, and sort of discussing the background culturally in Germany, but also in Europe more broadly, and in the discipline of philology, of how the Greeks were regarded, and how that changed with Nietzsche, and how he was influenced by Burckhardt, and then his whole narrative, not only his comments on each of the individual pre-Platonic philosophers, but his whole narrative about the war of the theoretic against the tragic. And so, maybe that could be a PhD dissertation. I don't really know what the standards are. I would be very nervous submitting any of these things to a review board, right? Because I'm not really part of that world. I don't really know what their standards are. I'm sure they would, be really interested in making sure the bibliography was perfect and all of these things that I'm not. Although I did actually, for the upcoming book on Nietzsche and the Greeks, bibliography is pretty good. I hope it's pretty good. We'll see what the editors have to say about it. But thank you, Matt. Let's move on to Philosopher Habits, who writes, "Hey Keegan, I've had a strange relationship with reading Nietzsche's philosophy, where it doesn't feel like I'm just understanding ideas, but almost being taken over by them or dissolving into them. Your podcasts awoke something in me which taught me how to write poetry spontaneously, which I could never do before. And like Goethe, I doubted whether I could actually do it. You have been a major influence and guide in the flourishing of my own thought. I started listening to your podcasts when I was 20, and I am now 23. There are moments where my sense of self loosens and it feels less like I am thinking and more like something is moving through me. It reminds me of what Nietzsche points towards with the Dionysian, not as a concept, but as something lived, where individuality starts to break down into something more unified and fluid. I should say as well, some of this happened while I was listening to your podcast and using weed and occasionally mushrooms, not in a reckless way, but almost as a way of opening myself up to the experience. It felt like the philosophy wasn't just being understood, but enacted or revealed. This has also shown up in my dreams. I did read through this. I'm just going to kind of gloss over the paragraph, seeing a wizard standing at the bottom of the stairs, um, a series of words that he could see behind the wizard, conscious, unconscious, and a third word that was something like Agartha. And so this has shown up in his dreams as well. Let's get to the question. So I'm wondering, have you ever experienced anything like this yourself through engaging with Nietzsche? Not just understanding him, but undergoing something like a Dionysian dissolution that affects your dreams, your sense of self, and way meaning appears. And how would you interpret that, psychological, physiological, or something more fundamental to what philosophy is doing? Thank you, Philosopher Habits. I think, honestly, I hate to admit this. So I hesitate before even saying this, but I would say that experiences like that have happened for me more so when I was reading Jung than when I was reading Nietzsche. At least regarding the dreams. I mean, that's where, when I was deeply studying Carl Jung, I would have very Jungian dreams. I still do from time to time. And, I'm sure a Jungian would argue that that's, I was just glimpsing the collective unconscious. Jung just gave me the language for understanding it. It's not that the texts cause you to have Jungian dreams. It's just you're able to understand them and retain them. We're doing all this dreaming. We have all these experiences, in our unconscious mind that the vast majority of which we forget. Now, by the time I was studying Jung, I already knew Nietzsche's work very well. I think that helped me process a lot of Jung's work. I think Nietzsche is good for that for a lot of different writers, but particularly with Jung. And so I already kind of had that software running in the background when I approached Jung. I do remember having those experiences. I mean, I've talked about this a lot where, it's not so much that, I'm reading along with Nietzsche, or that the standard experience, right? You open a book by Nietzsche and you're reading along and you're seeing a series of arguments and you're like, yeah, I agree with that argument and I agree with that argument. I don't think that's the standard experience. Maybe that's the case if you're reading someone like, again, Hume. But Nietzsche, when you're reading Nietzsche, at least my experience is, what's interesting to me about it is that he has such a distinctive way of viewing the world. And often his way of understanding things can even be a little bit unsurprising, but you can always see why. Even when Nietzsche takes you on some twists and turns, you're like, oh, that's definitely a Nietzschean way to make that twist or turn or subvert my expectations. But in general, you're seeing the way he sees the world. And it is where it's not so much acceding to or agreeing with individual arguments, but you have certain moments that don't come spontaneously. It's not just, a sort of totally magical thing that just happens. It's like you're sort of slowly putting yourself into his worldview until something clicks and you go, aha, I'm seeing the world the way that Nietzsche does. And this can happen with many different thinkers. Many different continental philosophers are like this, where you sort of have to just follow the author, the writer, the philosopher. You have to, be taken on this journey by them and just let yourself go along for the ride, which is maybe something that you're sort of talking about here, where it's not as if, it doesn't feel like the ideas are coming from you. It doesn't feel like you're just understanding or comprehending things, but maybe it feels like you're being taken over by them and dissolving into them, because you're having these moments where the light bulb goes off and you see the whole canvas of reality the way that Nietzsche would see it. And, that can be very compelling. And when you take a step into a completely different view of the world from your own, it can feel somewhat disorienting, or as if the scales are falling from your eyes, right? It can be a very pseudo-religious experience. So whereas I don't really think I had that exact experience of like being dissolved or of, my dream life getting taken over by Nietzsche, I've had those moments when reading particularly Beyond Good and Evil and Birth of Tragedy, and for very different reasons. With Beyond Good and Evil, it was in some sense like the critique of metaphysics and the apparent certainty of all previous philosophers, and that sort of did something to my brain where I was kind of like, oh, okay, I see this, the scope of Nietzsche's relativism, his skepticism, what he's trying to do here, and how it's very different from, say, again, a Humean skepticism. Don't know why I'm comparing Nietzsche to Hume over and over again, but it's been fruitful comparisons, I think. And Birth of Tragedy for a totally different reason, perceiving this view of aesthetics that actually mapped very well onto the way I was experiencing the world. And that, it probably did. I did get a little bit, I don't want to say obsessed, but Apollo and Dionysus, and more so just this whole idea of like art as a force, and the idea of sort of spirits being animated through art. And there was a lot of occultism and esotericism and mysticism going around during that time in the musical community. And it's already kind of reality warping when you're on tour because it messes with your perception of time. It sets you aside from society in some ways because you become like a traveler within your own society. It's like the Rush song, Fly By Night. You're in a city for one day and then you leave. So you're seeing all of life sort of play out around you, but you're not really a part of it. And because you're moving from city to city and state to state, it's not like your actions don't have consequences. And we're not like going around committing crimes or anything, but it's like, it is things where it's like, maybe I would just compare it to something as simple as this, right? You say something rude, get into an argument with someone at the bar you go to every night. It's very different from that happening, yelling at the sound guy when you're on tour, and then you're gone from that city and you're probably never going to see that person again, right? But more than anything, it's just the perception of time where you don't, in your ordinary day-to-day life, many of your experiences will just sort of get, they all blur together, right? If you're doing the same thing every day, then no day within the week will be particularly distinctive. And if you're doing the same thing every week, then no week within the month will be particularly distinctive. And that's why people say, oh, the time just flew by. Oh, I can't believe it's already been months later, because you're not having any distinct experiences or meeting new people or doing different things. You're in a routine doing the same thing over and over again. And so your perception of time, for many people, that's the ordinary perception of time, right? Every day is the same. Whereas if every day is different and there's novelty all the time, and you're messing with your sleep schedule and all sorts of things, you're not able to sort of file the memories away in just sort of like, okay, another week, another week, another week. In a way, it changes everything, and in a way that's kind of hard for me to describe if you haven't experienced it. I talked about it a little bit in my book. But so yeah, I've had some experiences where I'm like, oh wow, and I get really enraptured with the Apollo Dionysus idea, right? But part of that has to be understood through what was going on in my life. I mean, you just said you're in your early 20s. That's a time of transformation. That's where people kind of discover who they are, right? That's where you're going to become who you are, is over the course of your 20s. And I mean, that's not exactly true. You can still change and develop it as you're older, but that's kind of when people figure out who they are as adults, right? And so, especially if you're taking in these ideas that are really powerful and seem very sort of, what would we say? Not, if not persuasive, I mean, powerful is the right word. I'll just leave it at that, right? Very powerful ideas, and you're able to sort of, you're not getting there by argument or understanding, but you're breaking into a new way of seeing the world that's totally different and alien from the way most normies see the world. It's going to feel like they're taking over you. And the thing is, the fact you've unlocked this ability to write poetry, keep unlocking new talents and abilities. Keep being open to the possibility of the muse flowing through you, because that's how it happens. I've had a whole period of my life where I was writing poetry rather seriously, devotedly. Part of that was like I'd taken some classes on poetry to help to better learn to write lyrics, but then I started reading a lot of poetry and really enjoyed it. Certain kinds of poetry. I'm more into the older stuff, but that's neither here nor there. But even like things like, taking on, like I had a sketchbook for a long time. I got really good at that. I don't regret anything that, I've sank time into, even the things that I don't do to the extent that I used to do them now, because, I could just see even then how it is true the way the Greeks saw things, that a muse sort of moves through you. And yeah, I think most people have way more capabilities and way more untapped potential than they ever realize. And instead they choose to live lives of quiet desperation. So I say throw yourself into it. But I wouldn't, don't be too self-conscious or self-aware about any of this, right? Most of the way that Nietzsche has transformed my life has been my actual day-to-day attitudes. there are some aphorisms of his that I'm able to bring to mind at certain points, and in a way, maybe this is ironic, maybe it's a misuse of Nietzsche, I use them to regulate myself morally, quote unquote, not in the sense of the conventional morality or herd morality, but in the sense of, just regulating my own actions, right? And so reminding myself when I'm being reactive, or reminding myself occasionally that passion is better than stoicism and hypocrisy, certain lines that I bring to mind. But it's really been my conscious world and my day-to-day life that's been greatly improved by Nietzsche. And that's even the wrong way to think about it, because I don't want to sell it as a self-improvement thing. But it's nice to be able to live in a world that is innocent and that I love and that I'm grateful for, and to love fate and to love those around me, and to, whenever I'm able, to have the power to simply look away as my only negation from things, and to really love life and really understand, like, oh, wow, the great gift of being alive, the great, incredible fate of being alive where I am and when I am, is something that I can't squander, and I can't be ungrateful for, and I can't, spend my life worrying about what comes afterward, when it seems like, all the stories about that have been just avoidance of this world. That's really where it's cashed out for me. So in any case, thank you, Philosopher Habits. I think, let it affect your dreams, your sense of self, but also read widely, explore your capabilities widely. You've unlocked this ability to write poetry. Develop that. Read all the poets, There's so many great poets that nobody reads. Poetry is, it truly is. I did that episode on Eric Heller and sort of like the death of poetry and the decline, of it, how poetry used to be the highest art, the most important art of society in a way. It's like, when we look at what it's become, it's rather depressing. But there are people out there who will lament. They'll be like, "Oh, I hate all this postmodern poetry," or like, because there is, like, I have no interest in many of the modern tropes of poetry, where it's like this sort of pretentious arrangement of words and lines that isn't actually good wordsmithing. It's not actually good poetry. It's just sort of trying to jumble things around and make some point. I don't know. But people will say that, and they'll complain about that, right? But then it's not like they themselves are reading poetry and buying poetry books and looking for new poets who are trying to write in the style of Byron or Goethe. No one cares about them, right? And that's why the art form has died. And that's why it's like sort of a parody of itself. And many of the people who complain about it, it's like, well, they're not out supporting poets, right? So, and that's typical crisis of the modern world. Everyone will lament the state of, education and the classics. Oh, really? Are you all in a hurry to go read the classics? Maybe our audience here at the Nietzsche podcast is, but, again, a lot of complaining and not enough action from society. Sorry, I got a little derailed there at the end. But hopefully that answers your question, Philosopher Habits. So thank you. And man, we just have a lot of long questions, so it's going to be a longer Q&A, even though there are fewer questions than last time. But them's the breaks, right? So let's go to ZZZ123, who says, from reading Nietzsche to living Nietzsche, I've been a long-time listener, but the show's deep dives into the secondary literature have genuinely helped my own study. But they've also brought me to a crossroads in how I actually engage with Nietzsche. Coming from a Theravada Buddha background, studying Nietzsche feels less like adopting different perspectives and more like a fundamental physiological shift, moving from a philosophy of self-extinguishing and detachment to the sensory experiences, seeing them as dissatisfying due to impermanence. So I'll ask directly, why ought a modern person take up Nietzsche today? Is he diagnosing and treating a specific contemporary sickness, like nihilism and the rise of the last man, or is he mostly useful only to those already predisposed toward life affirmation? And actually, I'm going to pause with ZZZ123's question here to refer to an earlier question. I forget by who, but where they were saying, well, is Nietzsche's life affirmation just purely descriptive? And I would say, I'm willing to bite that bullet. You can read it that way. If he says my formula for greatness is amor fati, that someone could love their entire fate, wanting nothing to be different, either forwards or backwards or in the present moment, in a way he's saying that's like the touchstone, right, of whether or not they're a great person. But I don't think Nietzsche's point is to say, you should strive really hard to love your fate. Because, I mean, should the coal miner do that? Maybe the coal miner, a Marxist would say, maybe the coal miner should get together with his buddies and change their fate with some rifles, or like, you don't even have to be a communist. You could just be one of the West Virginia mine workers in the 1920s where, they called out the National Guard to fight them, right? These giant strikes and basically labor wars, as they called them, right? So maybe that would be more appropriate for them. Maybe Christianity would be more appropriate for the coal miner, right? In the same way that it was appropriate for the Roman slave. Or maybe there are some of them who can love their fate. Maybe they do just genuinely love mining coal. They have a dwarven sort of outlook on the world, right? So there's all sorts of possibilities. But yeah, I don't think Nietzsche should be taken prescriptively, because then that sort of turns into a universal normative claim about how everyone should live. And I don't think Nietzsche thinks that that's feasible, and I don't think he sees the world that way. He's looking to speak to the people who love their fate, who are a select group of people. And so perhaps, and so none of this really addresses ZZZ123's questions, but is he mostly useful only to those already predisposed toward life affirmation? That is entirely possible. And I would, if somebody said that about Nietzsche, I would be like, yeah, it's kind of true. I'm not going to argue against that. But now to more directly address your question, right? Is he, and I'm going to get to the rest of what you wrote in a little bit, but is he just here to address nihilism and the rise of the last man? Well, I mean, again, it's like, he thinks that we are approaching a kind of moral crisis, a kind of crisis of our values, which seems to me to be the case, and that we will require new legislations and new valuations, and that man will need a new morality, that man would rather will anything rather than not will at all. If it is important to you that the human race continues in a more beautiful, stronger, life-affirming form, Nietzsche can't make you want that. How could he possibly make you want that? If you're not invested in that whole conflict, then yeah, true, he has nothing to say to you. Now, if you see sensory experience as fundamentally dissatisfying due to impermanence, I mean, as you point out, that's the Theravada Buddhist approach. And that's sort of like, these are fundamental judgments about reality, right? That can't be litigated with logic. Nietzsche can't do it. I can't do it. You can't do it. All you can do is decide, right? Is the dissatisfaction from impermanence, does that outweigh any grand project for the human species? If yes, then Buddhism is your answer, right? There's nothing I could say to you. Now, within each of these traditions, right? Within Nietzsche's view, he would say, well, the Buddhist approach is fundamentally, it's directly addressing the problem of suffering. It's the ideology that arises at the end of a civilization and the twilight of a civilization. He likens it in many ways to Epicureanism, and that parallel, I think, is incredibly useful. So Nietzsche would have his own, if you accept his judgments about reality, then from within that lens, you're going to see a physiological explanation for why Buddhism is the way it is. It's effectively dealing with the exhaustion of a people at the end of a civilizational project or something like this. So many people are going to sort of be of a certain constitution that they're going to end up being Buddhists, and that Nietzsche thinks that's way better for them to do than be Christian, right? Let's make that clear. But Buddhism will then also have its own, if you make the judgment, no, the dissatisfaction of impermanent existence is the ultimate problem, and it destroys any value that there might be in Nietzsche's project or his revaluation, then you can sort of look at Nietzsche through the Buddhist lens and say, well, he's ultimately just trapping himself in samsara. And ultimately the story of Nietzsche is like the same old story of most of the deluded people in samsara, tricking themselves, lying themselves into thinking that there's some worthwhileness or value of pursuing their desire in the moment, when in the end, in the long term, they always realize that it wasn't as satisfying as they thought it was, and that it leads them to more suffering and more pain. They're just stuck in this endless cycle. And then some new thing comes up and they say, no, that's something of great value that I'm going to pursue. You can then read Nietzsche that way, that there's nothing really particularly remarkable about Nietzsche from the Buddhist perspective. He's just an apologist for samsara, which all of us are every day, every time we make a decision to ignore the truth of impermanence and still pursue impermanent things. And indeed, Nietzsche himself says this. We need lies, we need illusions. Life will seduce us with its illusions into continuing to perpetuate life's goals. So he would admit this. So, when you say you're at a crossroads, I believe that because it's a true crossroads, right? They're irreconcilable positions, and there's no way to really logically come up with a reason why one is better than the other. It all comes down to your judgment about reality. So let me continue with your question. I'm going to try to read the rest of it. I'll admit something uncomfortable. As I've studied him, I've noticed my behavior shifting in ways I'm not entirely proud of. More arrogance, and some morally iffy habits creeping in. I've heard Greg Sadler describe something similar in his own Nietzsche phase. Am I misreading him, or is this uncomfortable dissolution simply part of the process? Second, on commentary as a shield, I've spent serious time with Lawrence Lampert and other strong secondary guides building what feels like a solid conceptual foundation, but I'm starting to wonder whether I've been using that scaffolding to avoid the raw, visceral, irritating, and seductive affect of Nietzsche's primary prose. Is a clean conceptual understanding actually sufficient, or is being genuinely provoked, even wounded by the texts themselves, a mechanical necessity for whatever transformation Nietzsche wants to produce in a reader? Third, on extending the project into the body, I want to broaden my focus into health, wellness, and human movement, as those are also a passion for me, and I have a bit of physical pain, without losing the Nietzschean base, because other than Buddhism, that is the philosophy I'm now most familiar with. I've considered going back to Schopenhauer or Heraclitus, or laterally into Max Scheler on resentment. But I keep returning to Peter Sloterdijk, whose concept of anthropotechnics seems to capture the practice of self-overcoming in a way pure Nietzsche doesn't quite land. Who provides the strongest bridge from Nietzsche into the architecture of the body and human optimization, and is the optimization framing itself even compatible with what Nietzsche was actually doing? I hope these questions resonate with other listeners who are trying to move from merely reading philosophy to actually living it. Thank you, ZZZ123. So you asked quite a lot there. I mean, the first thing about your behavior shifting in ways you're not proud of. Morally iffy habits. I mean, that covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? That's kind of the problem with these moral categories of good and evil, if I can digress for a moment. I mean, that's part of Nietzsche's problem, is that saying something is morally iffy, so it might be bad, right? It might be evil. We don't have to be that dramatic, but you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, it would be very easy to say that Nietzsche's own framework of health and sickness, well, aren't those just essential categories? But no, I don't think they are. I think there are far more flexible categories. It can still be used in that rather inflexible way, and I think that's a mistake, but we've already talked about in this Q&A the idea that you could have poison that could be medicinal. You can have sickness that actually ultimately leads to a greater health when it's overcome. You can have, and therefore the sickness in some sense being the health owing its strength to that sickness. And you can have gradations and all these sort of levels to health and sickness, right? And things that might be sick in one period but healthy in another, and it's contextual and all of these things. Whereas good and evil, it sort of groups morally iffy. That could cover, everything to like, I've started taking up a drug habit, to like, I've started beating the crap out of people, right? Which are, to me, are like incredibly very different things, right? But the main thing to me is you say you're not proud of them. So if you're not proud of your arrogance, then that seems to me like you're dissatisfied with being arrogant. So check your arrogance, right? How do you do that? Well, Nietzsche has that passage on how to deal with vehement drives. If you feel it's a vehement drive, then maybe look at that passage. But a really easy way is just to be humbled, right? I could never be arrogant in chess because I know because I am humbled all the time when I play chess, because there are probably millions of players who are better than I am. Maybe I could be arrogant about, knowing a lot about philosophy, but philosophy is such a massive field with so many writers and interpretations and so much complexity to it, and it's impossible to know everything about everything when it comes to philosophy. And I'm humbled by the brilliance of other people that I speak to, and that's part of why I shift my perspective and look at all these people outside of Nietzsche's perspective. Almost every philosophical position I take, there are absolutely brilliant people who take the opposite position. So, like, I have no ground to be arrogant. I would simply say being arrogant is very rarely productive, right? It's very, man, let me give you a totally nerdy example. There's an episode of Star Trek Voyager where there are the species of hunters. You can think of them like predators, right? Only, they seem like more sophisticated. Like they'll you see them actually speak to each other, and they have a whole articulated philosophy of being hunters and everything. And at one point, they capture the Starship Voyager, and they put everyone into like a holodeck simulation of World War II, where they play the Nazis, and the Voyager crew were like the French resistance. So they get to like hunt them, right? They're going through all there's presumably many different sort of historical things in the Voyager database, and they're like, oh, this is a dream come true. We can satisfy our urge to hunt by just playing out all these different things from their history and hunting them in these simulations. Anyway, one of the hunters, who's the sort of the second in command, is arguing with the commander, and he's saying, well, why are we doing this? Like, we should just kill them and move on. Why are we doing this simulation thing? And the commander is sort of, his attitude is like, we're going to be destroyed as a species because we've become totally nomadic. We haven't built anything. We're just obsessed with this one thing. But they have this really, the whole reason I brought this up, they had this interesting conversation where one of the hunters is actually starting to like onboard the Nazi ideology and talk about how, well, we're like genetically superior to these humans. And the head of the species of hunters, they're called the Herogen, at least this little group of them, gets really mad, and he says, you're superior to no one. When the hunter starts thinking he's superior to his prey and just takes that as a first principle, that's when he makes a mistake. To relate it back to chess again, right? I think it was Emanuel Lasker who said the hardest position to win is a one position, right? The position where you're totally winning, and it seems like I would have to make a huge mistake or a huge oversight to blunder my way into a loss here, and that's when that happens, because you're simply being arrogant. So is arrogance really, everyone talks about Nietzscheans becoming arrogant. I guess for one, I would say, why do you think you have a right to arrogance just because you read Nietzsche? Does that make you as brilliant as Nietzsche? No, it doesn't, right? So are you one of Nietzsche's great men? Well, maybe you are. What have you done to deserve that arrogance? If it's simply like, well, I have these Nietzschean ideas that are superior to the morality of the herd, but you're still living like one of the herd, well, then you're not superior. And yet again, arrogance is something that's actually hindering you in that case. So arrogance, I would say, in general, is a pretty non-productive emotion or way of viewing the world. And if you're not proud of it, why not try and check your arrogance then? That's within your power, right? Do you need Buddhism to do that? Maybe you do. Some people do, right? They need a religion. Now, you talk about using commentary as a shield. Like maybe Nietzsche's own words are a bit too, or they're like really potent and savage and ferocious. And you put it in a certain way, right? That the raw, visceral, irritating, seductive effect of Nietzsche's primary prose. Yeah, I mean, that's a common thing people say, that many of the commenters, I mean, people say it all the time about Kaufman, that he softened Nietzsche. And, on that point, I don't know. I mean, I would always recommend reading the primary source because it's going to be a better reading experience than pretty much any commenter on Nietzsche. I'll say that. So there's that point. But, aside from that, oftentimes we're actually looking to the secondary sources in order to draw out some nuance that might not be as explicit in Nietzsche, or compare him to someone else, or try and isolate or abstract a certain idea that he revisits that maybe, gets developed sort of in the background of his thought. There's all sorts of great reasons for reading secondary literature. So, I don't know. Like, I'm not going to tell you what you should do. There seem like there are a lot of, maybe you're not trying to say this, but it seems like there's a lot of, me telling you what you should do that maybe is being asked here. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to tell you, no, you have to read Nietzsche's prose and let it dissolve you, like Philosopher Habits was saying. Maybe that's not appropriate. Maybe you're getting more out of the secondary literature. I mean, who am I to tell you what to read? And then with the last question on Sloterdijk, I guess, and, extending the project into the body. I don't really know exactly what you mean by optimization in this context, optimization of the body, but I mean, I'll just address that last question of in terms of you're trying to move from merely reading philosophy to actually living it. This is something I said in my conversation with Paul when we were reacting to a video sort of trashing a lot of philosophy content. He was making a similar point. The point of philosophy is to improve your life. I don't actually think that's the case. I think that philosophy for me is a joy. It's a pleasure. It's something I am grateful to be able to do that, yes, can it improve my life? I likened it to like mountain climbing or skydiving, playing the guitar, taking up a sport, taking up a hobby, writing poetry like Philosopher Habits is doing, right? Do all of these things improve your life? Well, I suppose so, but the point isn't improvement. They are pleasurable in and of themselves and for themselves. They justify themselves. We do everything, all of our other sort of functional utilitarian activities of working and, holding down a job, paying bills, putting time and effort into all sorts of things, right? Practical, functional things in our lives. That ends up being the means for which these pleasurable activities are the ends. And I'm speaking in very, perhaps unfortunately, utilitarian terms here that I'm just trying to simplify and get to the point. I don't mean pleasure just hedonically, because it could even be something that people would say is like really meaningful beyond hedonic pleasure, like being able to watch your son graduate college or, write like a great album or a great work of poetry, or these things that aren't just like, they're not just pleasurable in the sense of getting a dopamine hit. We're talking about a kind of higher order pleasure, and I think philosophy can be a part of that. And I think it is a wholesome way to spend your leisure time, right? That all leisure time can be seen as just something that you do for its own sake, but you can spend your leisure time just merely entertaining yourself in a way that doesn't improve your life. I think where people get into, whereas like philosophy could be something where it's like you're learning things. Maybe you're seeing the world a different way. Maybe you're gaining new perspectives. Maybe you're just maybe you want to be a writer yourself, and reading Nietzsche's prose can be very useful. Maybe you want to be a philosopher yourself, and his ideas help you midwife your own into existence. There's all sorts of things. But I think people get caught in this whole idea that like philosophy is self-help or self-improvement, and I need to live this, and I need to like bring, I can't just take in these ideas. They have to change my life. And that I think is the wrong attitude. If you have it within yourself to change your life, if you have the reason, the necessity, if you have the drive to do so, then perhaps philosophy can become a part of that process. Perhaps that can become something that you seize upon in order to facilitate that process. But I don't think that philosophy implants ideas in your brain that then manifest in behavior, and that's the point of philosophy. I think a great deal of why I advocate for a philosophical life, not for everyone, but at least for myself and people who feel the similar way to myself, is because it's pleasurable, it's justified, it justifies itself out of the enjoyment that we get out of it. The great luxury of being able to stand aside from life and inquire into the nature of things it's so wonderful. It can be incredibly meaningful, and gaining some insight and everything into the nature of human psychology, and indeed into our own psychology. But I mean, for me, if you just want a straight answer, right? How do I live Nietzsche's philosophy, right? I would say that it's the experimental way of life of committing to, independently of what society says you should do, or the values you've inherited from your parents or from a church, discovering who you are, becoming who you are, realizing the potential you have, and what it is that gives you the highest sense of pleasure. And again, the highest sense, not just a dopamine hit, not just some hedonic thing, not just comfort, but What is it that really makes you feel alive and fulfilled? And pursue that and throw everything into it and risk everything on that. Be willing to perish for it. That's what I'm saying. And I'm not saying I live up to that at all times. But, and I've even had people sort of say, like, well, what do you know about Nietzsche? What do you know about living dangerously? Like, as if living dangerously means I have to go, fight in a war or something like that. The thing is, whenever I talk about these things, I'm not trying to claim some sort of personal, like, bona fides or like some personal authority of I know what it means to live dangerously. I can only tell you how Nietzsche has manifested it in my life. And I'm not trying to say like I'm some swashbuckling adventurer, but simply that devoting everything in my life to music and philosophy, right, is a pretty, just according to the normal sorts of calculations that people make about what a smart move, would be in life, and the utilitarian concerns of how to construct your life in such a way that, like the Jordan Peterson thing is the total opposite of this, where he says, well, no, everything in our life has to be, you have to be making decisions that iterated over a long span of time are going to produce the best outcome. And you have to think about what things are going to be like when you're old or when your parents die and you need to take over at their funeral and all of these things. This is why this comes off as selfish or arrogant, but of basically saying like, no, I'm actually going to live for, I'm not going to circumscribe the decisions I make in my life according to like what things could go wrong or making sure my ass is covered in every circumstance, right? Or, well, what am I going to do when I'm old and it's time to retire? Essentially living for your old age, right? Living for, I have to make all these responsible decisions so then maybe I can enjoy my retirement when I'm 70 fucking years old. And, it's like then I can go fishing and buy a boat or whatever. If that's really what you want to do with your life, figure out how to do that right now, right? And that might involve making some risky decisions. It might end in failure. You might ruin yourself. You might ruin relationships that you have. You might, any number of things, right? But in a way, the philosophy I take from Nietzsche is to see how those are all such cheap costs to bear. There were people who took on far greater risks throughout history where they really were risking life and limb. And therefore, to sort of live the life of quiet desperation and to do nothing towards your own goals of what gives you the highest feeling in life, or make that just like relegated to the weekend, or, like pushed off into some far future that you might one day get to after you made all these responsible decisions. It's a recipe for just an unhappy life. And a lot of the time, then it has to be justified with this heaven claim, that, okay, well then it's again, the ultimate forestalling of all meaning and pleasure in life into the future that occurs after you die. Right. And so that's what I'm sort of against is being, what I want people to do is experiment, live their lives as an experiment, be willing to incur the risk, chase down what you are driven to do. It's not just be yourself or live authentically or all these things. No, if you really want to talk about this, you have to, or if you really want to put this into practice, you have to be willing to burn bridges. You have to be willing to roll the dice. It's one of the things I love about Bataille. He's always talking about chance and the dice throw. It's a chancy thing. It's a risky thing. But that's what I take from Nietzsche. There's no universalist prescription that you're going to get out of this, other than it's ultimately a universalist prescription that redounds back to your own perspective and your particular way of being in the world. What is it that justifies your existence, right? You have one. You have one eternal life to live because it's going to eternally recur. What is it that would justify that existence? Do you have any excuse for not giving everything over to that? And the problem is a lot of people can't think of anything that would justify it, right? They want to be freed from the yoke. They don't know what for. And I can't help you with that. Nietzsche can't help you with that. So that would be my advice, I guess. I can't tell you what you should do. I can only tell you the attitude towards life that I've developed out of Nietzsche's works. And that's also why it's impossible for me to tell you what you should do, because it's going to depend on things that are incredibly particular to you, right? That you have to figure out. And a lot, that's the thing, is that the herd way of life, there's nothing to figure out. It's all handed to you ready-made ahead of time. And perhaps that's better for most people. I've been very open about that from the beginning of the podcast. That might be better, right? Telling everyone they need to go reevaluate their own, be a living reevaluation of values yourself. Be a pretty destructive thing to think everyone should practice that. But yeah, from reading Nietzsche into living Nietzsche, that's my advice. Let's go to Ian Savage. He writes, "Hello, Keegan, and thank you for all that you do. I'm going to be hosting a very small book club soon of Nietzsche's works, and I am letting the readers choose where to start. I did send them to your video, but ultimately I'm not sure where they'll want to start. I'm familiar enough with most of Nietzsche's work except Daybreak, and have been studious in the Greeks and secondary literature for quite a while now. However, this will be my first time leading any sort of lesson around them. What advice could you give to a first-time teacher, quote-unquote, of Nietzsche, and what pitfalls would you recommend I try to avoid? Thank you, Ian." Well, a book club is very different from what I do in the podcast, where it's an interactive and you're bringing in other people's opinions. So you have to be respectful of their opinions. Probably don't shoot people down. It's probably good to practice the yes and rather than yes but, unless they're saying something that just directly contradicts the text or is a misreading. Paul, my friend P.F. Jung, who's running some book clubs, his advice for people was essentially that you have to have you have to be able to sort of have the most of it is just like moderation is what he was saying, in terms of you have to be able to cut people off if they're pontificating too long, give people the ability to speak and get in their ideas. But as far as to the extent that you're going to be teaching or leading the discussion, this is what I would say. For one, the final authority is the text, right? There's going to be, and even the specific text you're on, so that the text that you're looking at from Nietzsche, there's a whole corpus of Nietzsche's works that you can appeal to that will have, more elaborated ideas of perhaps, if you're reading a work like, let's say, The Gay Science, where will to power hasn't been really fully developed, but you can see these ideas that are basically articulating the idea before Nietzsche has a full framework for it. Then you could reference other works that talk about will to power, right? But ultimately, I think with a book club where you're trying to understand a particular book, it's really good to, there's concentric circles, right? First and foremost, the text itself, then the rest of the author's corpus, things they've said about the book, the circumstances in which they write the book, so on and so forth. Then you can get into sort of influences on the book, precursors from outside the author's corpus. Then you get into interpretations, right? These are all concentric circles, as I said. So it's all valid. You can bring all of it in, but at the end of the day, anchor yourself to the text. And that's what I do in the episodes, right? People, if you start going off on some general explanation of Nietzsche's philosophy, that's all well and good, but it needs to be anchored to the text itself. And a close reading of the text with your own notes is going to be incredibly helpful. You have to teach it to yourself before you can teach it to anyone else. So write it all out. Write out everything you're thinking. Organize your thoughts. And with a text like The Gay Science, for example, I'm just using that as an example. I don't know what book you're doing. It's not like a text that has necessarily its own organization scheme. So you have to sort of, there are certain threads throughout the entire text where these aphorisms don't appear in any organized way, but on certain topics, you can kind of find them scattered throughout the text and cross-reference them with one another. That's all very useful. I would mark down or pull out any of the useful or particularly illuminating aphorisms you want to talk about from Nietzsche or the sections. It's hard for me I remember when I was leading that class, Jason, who is one of the patrons here, he was in the class, and some of them were kind of asking me about my methods and, how do I make the podcast? And there was something he kind of said at the end of the discussion where he said, I can tell that you just sort of do this automatically, or this is I forget how he put it exactly. This is just a personality type thing for you. You just have an aptitude for this, and it's very hard for you to explain it. And I was like, yes, that's exactly right, So, but for me, it's 90% of this, of teaching something, is note-taking and being anchored to the text, being devoted to the text, right? Treat it like it's a holy book and it's a sin to falsify it, right? Before you go off and make your own interpretations. And try to basically, yeah, take in the whole thing, but be very devoted to the particular passages that you're talking about. Look at the passages right there in black and white and what Nietzsche actually says. Make sure that you don't teach anything before you can explain what every single word or like every single phrase in a passage you're talking about means, right? If you're going to talk about it. And yeah, it's mostly a note-taking thing. It's mostly just a matter of being able to retain what you've read and draw insights from it, which is only going to come from taking studious notes. And so then all the things that I've said sort of apply to that. And there's a social element to it too, right, that I already kind of mentioned, and that's kind of outside of my wheelhouse. That's why I just do a podcast by myself. I don't have to deal with anyone else. But thank you, Ian Savage. That's the best advice I can give. Next, we have Leon Earl. He writes, "Thanks for all the great episodes. I don't know if this has been asked before, but I wonder which you consider the most Nietzschean bands artists out there. They don't need to have cited Nietzsche as an influence explicitly. You can judge by the lyrics, tone, or even the general movement which has formed around them. I also have a question concerning the universality or lack thereof in Nietzsche's writing. It seems like he wants even the average person to overcome idealism and step out from God's shadow, but he also states the exclusivity of his intended audience. Is there a meaningful division between sharing, say, his epistemology on truth and unequal things for framing thought, and encouraging the specific value judgments each individual's manifestation of the will to power might produce within those frameworks? In short, are there specific aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy that should, for lack of a better word, be propagated at a mass scale? Perhaps you could also address this in lieu of the influence Nietzsche has already had on the culture and language, which I personally see as a rather crude implementation. Since the boulder is already rolling, might it be prudent to steer it?" Thank you for those questions. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the end, like try and control the way that culture implements Nietzsche. Well, I don't think any individual has control over that. I mean, a few rare people attain a level of popularity that they can start to sort of legislate opinions, and we saw that with Jordan Peterson. Unfortunately, the kinds of people that the masses uplift to that level of popularity are people like Jordan Peterson. So, they're going to uplift people that are saying things back to them that they want to hear. And I'm sure the Peterson stands will say, oh, what could you possibly mean by that? I mean, you're saying what people want to hear is to take responsibility for yourself? That's not a very placating message, or, that seems like it's a hard teaching or whatever. And it's like, nah, herd animals love hearing about their responsibilities. I don't think it was a particularly subversive message to say, clean your room and be disciplined. It's like kind of the opposite of a subversive message. Given that every society runs on those values, it's very clear those are the values that people do want to hear reproduced. And, I don't know. I just didn't, I don't think that he, of all the things that he said and did, right, his representation of Nietzsche was one of the worst mischaracterizations, one of the worst misreadings, a total abuse of Nietzsche for Christian purposes, right? And so for anything that he may have provided culturally that could have been positive, ultimately I think it was negative, and it's because his Christian herd animal audience they can only understand or deal with a Nietzsche that serves those values, right? So that's what always happens is you look at like who's going to have a say in steering the culture. Well, are they steering the culture, or is the culture steering them in some sense? Were they selected by the popularity contest for precisely the reason that they're giving a message that would be popular with the current culture, right? So I think it's very difficult to talk about trying to steer this sort of boulder that's already rolling. I mean, even in the example that as you give it, how are you going to steer a boulder that's already rolling? I mean, I'm sure you could come up with some things, but it seems like in practical terms, you got to just let it roll, But okay, most Nietzschean bands, artists, I don't know about that one. I don't know if there really are any, right? I mean, again, to the extent that, let me actually answer here. I'll answer your universality question first. Actually, it's already been pretty much answered by other questions, right? Does Nietzsche want the average person to overcome idealism and step out from God's shadow? Well, in some sense, the unfortunate reality of the situation as Nietzsche sees it is that it is only in the shadows of God in which we live, the scientific positivist metaphysics that we're generating and this realist view of the world and our utilitarian moral calculus, all these secularizations of the Christian morality, those don't have the same juice in them that the theological worldview that we have in the Middle Ages, right? It's totally the level of commitment to it, the level of inspiration and motivation that we get out of these worldviews is nothing compared to what the Christianity used to do for people, the way it grounded them and explained their suffering and justified their suffering and justified the existence of evil, gave them things to sacrifice for and even sacrifice themselves for, and grounded their morality and all of these things. I mean, all we have are shadows of God, and in some sense, that is the crisis. The crisis is the very fact that the average person may not be able to overcome idealism, but all they have is God's shadow. They don't have God anymore. God is dead, right? And that's unfortunate. So, there are those passages where Nietzsche sort of suggests the problem is that we have a herd and no shepherd, right? So that we're instrumentalizing everyone for turning everyone into homo economicus, turning everyone into a cog in the machine. But what is it a machine of? It's a machine of production and consumption. It's just a sort of hedonic, pleasure-generating, self-preservation-generating machine that's aimed at nothing higher. At least the Christian worldview aimed at something higher, right? At least it gave us something to sacrifice for that would be brought forth in the future. So, and that would sort of imply if the problem is that there's one herd but no shepherd, and that the values are sick precisely because they don't want a shepherd. They want no bellwether. They want no... Basically, it's just we just want to be one mass of ants, again, of herd animals, and we don't want, perhaps the issue is that for Nietzsche, all we might need is an atavistic person to come in and use the herd as the raw material for some new overcoming of humanity, something like that, right? We just need one legislator of values or one, genius figure to work with the herd, who would himself be a throwback because he would be, all of the values that we're promoting are values of subordination, subordinating yourself, instrumentalizing yourself. And this would be a person who actually has some sort of driving ambition that thinks they have a right to command and to subordinate others to himself. So maybe they could, use these people who are stuck in the shadows of God to do something productive. Maybe that's one possible way to read Nietzsche. Another way would be, as you say it, like maybe we need to shove them out from under that shadow into the bright sunlight of day to perceive the true situation and hasten ourselves along to these great wars of valuations that are going to occur over the coming centuries that he predicts, right? In which they'll realize that all values are up in the air, and the only way is to fight it out and see which value triumphs, right? Maybe that's one potential way to read Nietzsche. But as you've probably gathered through the things I've been saying, I think he would resist any attempt to put his philosophy into a universalist lens. That I don't think he would hope that we shove everyone outside of the shadows of God and idealism. I think what he would hope would be that those of us who are capable still of creating values can create some new myth for them to live in. Right? The problem with the death of God isn't, oh no, run back to Christianity. It's not, well, everyone's going to be a free, self-created individual. No, it's now the opportunity exists with the sundering of this stultifying monotheism for a sort of polytheistic contest of the gods to arise again. And that contest is not going to be fought on egalitarian terms. You're going to have people organizing themselves the way they always do into hierarchical structures according to the differing, competing orders of rank, competing valuation, like tables of valuations. And, each one of those will have someone who will be legislating values, or perhaps many people who are legislating the values for the herd. You see how people act, by the way. Come on, just look at politically how people behave. They behave like lemmings. They will follow whatever their leader says once they become self-identified with that. So it's that's the consciousness of most people. They're not going to step outside of the shadows of God in the sense of Nietzsche's not universalizing his task to become who you are and pursue the highest feeling for yourself. For everyone, he knows they're not capable of that. Again, I'm just kind of retreading previous ground. So no, Nietzsche's philosophy should not be propagated at a mass scale, which you might be saying, Keegan, what are you doing, right? Well, the thing is, I'm just trying to teach people about philosophy here. Yes, it's Nietzsche-centric, but I'm not I'm not trying to convert people to be Nietzscheans. And, I think that would be, I think that would even be an incorrect reading of Nietzsche himself. If anything, I'm trying to reclaim Nietzsche from people like Jordan Peterson, for one, but also, his very sort of the critics who caricature him and just view him as part of some, like Lukács, he's just an irrationalist and he's a problem, or, Nietzsche's just a fascist, or or people trying to claim him and be like, well, Nietzsche's part of my postmodern view of the world, or he's an Ayn Randian objectivist and we should worship businessmen, and like just all these like nonsense readings of Nietzsche. If anything, my goal with the podcast is not to create Nietzscheans, it's to destroy any sort of credibility of all these people who have tried to use Nietzsche for their narratives. I'm trying to take Nietzsche away from people. I'm trying to say, no, you can't have him. That doesn't work for, you think Nietzsche can just be seen as a sort of take responsibility for yourself objectivist? No, there are a million reasons why that doesn't work. Oh, well, Nietzsche is actually a proto-anarchist communist. No, he's not. He doesn't believe in equality of the human beings. He doesn't believe he can ever dispense with orders of rank or hierarchy, right? There are all sorts of people who have tried to take Nietzsche, turn him to their own purposes, use him for something. In Jordan Peterson's case, Nietzsche's part of this Jung, Dostoevsky sort of return to Christianity romanticism or whatever bullshit. No, I'm taking that away from them. I'm not trying to convert them into my species of Nietzscheanism. I'm trying to show people, in effect, every ideology that you've extracted out of Nietzsche is destroyed by Nietzsche himself. He doesn't permit these uses of him. Zarathustra tells us to repudiate him. And Nietzsche says he does not want to be the saint of a new religion. And he gives us the weapons with which we can deconstruct any moral claim, any philosophy, anything. He's given us the right of interpretation in order to interpret things according to our own aims and our own ends. And so, in a way, I'm showing on a perhaps a superordinate level the form of Nietzscheanism, the uber-modernist Nietzsche that destroys all ideologies. To the extent that itself is an ideology, okay, who cares? That's ultimately my goal. And I think, so I'm not trying to control the mass culture or steer the boulder towards a certain outcome. I hope to make things more uncertain for people who want to steal Nietzsche and appropriate him for their own ends by showing how Nietzsche actually allows any of us to deconstruct any such end. And why would I want to do that? Well, because I really believe that you should all think for yourselves and become who you are and repudiate Zarathustra and do the reading yourself and see how rich and amazing these ideas are and how it's situated within a certain milieu of philosophers that expands out throughout all history. Nietzsche's part of this great, incredible project, human project called philosophy. He gives us really powerful philosophy within that, but really powerful ideas. But the last thing he wanted was for people to become Nietzscheans and create an ideology and turn his work into just another form of busybody morality. Like, oh, you're acting like a slave moralist. Oh, you're acting like a last man. Oh, you're what Nietzsche warned us about, right? You're just recapitulating to the same moral pearl clutching, only now you're doing it with health and sickness instead of good and evil. Well, that doesn't get us anywhere. A lot of the things I'm saying here, I think if it hasn't clicked with you, if you don't really get it, it might be a little confusing. I'm reminded of Nietzsche talking about Machiavelli and how he allows us to breathe the dry, fresh air of Florence, walking at a brisk allegrissimo as he gives us a tour of the most disturbing sort of aspects of human nature and political life. I see Nietzsche as a similar sort of realist, we might say, as regards moral philosophy. And I think I want more people to breathe that dry, free air. The goal is never to create more Nietzscheans. So that being said, are there Nietzschean bands and artists? It's kind of hard, I'd have to know what's in their heart. I guess people who go all in and live for their highest pleasure and are willing to perish for it. If you can think of any bands or artists like that, then you evaluate whether or not they're Nietzschean. I hesitate to bring anyone up like that because, I don't know. It's you never know when something is just a pose or part of a brand or all an act. Musicians are all actors in some ways. You shouldn't trust them. And that goes for me too. But you know what I'm saying? Like in terms of like the persona they cultivate. There's so many metal bands, for example, that cultivate a badass. I'm a Satanist. I'm a very serious persona. To what degree is that real? Most of the time it's probably fake. And then the ones who are really living it, who are really bands like Watain, who are really like theistic Satanists. Ultimately, that's just like otherworldly Gnosticism, so I don't have much respect for it. I don't know. I guess I would say there have been many Nietzschean artists, basically any innovator or genius that was not trying to just follow the existing trend or write music within an established genre with the established tropes, but said, fuck all that, I'm going to do my own thing. And then it creates a whole genre from them doing it. That, in a way, is very Nietzschean. I don't really have a group of artists I could list off. Like, I'm going to be honest, guys, it's not the kind of thing I normally think about, right? That thought doesn't really go through my head. I wonder, is this guy Nietzschean? Occasionally I'll see a lyric, or I'll see a reference to something, or I'll see a certain attitude and go, huh, that's Nietzschean. Like, I'll recognize it, but, I'm not going through life evaluating who the Nietzscheans are and who the others aren't. In some sense, it doesn't concern me. It has nothing to do with me giving everything that I give to the great and impossible tasks that I've set for myself. Whether or not other people are doing the same, it's not something I have control over, and it's not something I really think about. So, yeah. Okay, Bart Rimmelsval says, imagine this scenario: you're about to forget every philosophical work you've ever read. But right before the brainwipe hits, you get a shot to write down a list of works that future, all too forgetful Keegan has to read. What works make the cut, and in what order? P.S. Limit yourself to 5 to 10 works. Okay, so I guess Beyond Good and Evil would be one of them, and then I would just trust myself that I would get back into Nietzsche from that one book, so I don't need to list a bunch of Nietzsche books. I'd probably find Socrates and Plato on my own, Maybe I would tell myself to... Yeah, we'll skip over all of that because I think it would be rather obvious and I would find it on my own. So aside from Beyond Good and Evil, let's just go to 5. If I was going to do 4 more works, I'd probably tell myself to read Michel de Montaigne, because you could get a whole of his essays in one giant collected work, and it's like it's something I always go back to, and I don't know. I guess I would have discovered Montaigne through Nietzsche eventually as well, but it would be good to sort of fast track that. I suppose, I might even go with Cassirer, Language and Myth, which is like, it's not like the most mind-blowing work in the world, but I remember that clued me into several things, like in conjunction with Nietzsche and ideas on language. That was like really, really helpful for me. So probably that work as well. I'm just trying to think about things that I think I wouldn't read, like I wouldn't naturally come across. Maybe Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, because critical theory is so maligned, and I really loved that book, and it was also very enlightening for me, so I could see like many people would probably avoid that one. And then maybe as a final choice, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There you go. That counts as philosophy. It was excluding things like fiction, like Goethe's Faust or Stendhal, or pure fiction that you like, Greek tragedies, things like this that you could draw philosophical conclusions out of. Trying to just stick to pure philosophy, I think those would be my picks. Would be Beyond Good and Evil, Montaigne's essays, Language and Myth by Cassirer, Dialectic of Enlightenment, and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I think if I forgot everything about philosophy, those would be the ones I'd be like, maybe. Like once I started on Nietzsche, I have faith I would expand out along very similar lines into all the influences that I've already found. Those other ones, I don't necessarily know if I would pick them up, right? And so, especially not like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, because it's so like maligned, totally unfairly maligned. But those are the ones I wouldn't want to like lose. I think I would naturally rediscover Socrates and Plato and all sorts of other people. So yeah, there we go. That is my answer, and I'm just going to limit it to 5. Because there's more questions and I don't want to come up with 5 more books. Okay, thank you very much, Bart. Next we have Derek A. Have you ever read any of Marshall McLuhan's books? If so, what are your thoughts on how modern mediums and technology impact art? It seems now more than ever that art divides instead of unifying, not to mention its superficiality and mass marketability. I have not read any of Marshall McLuhan's work. I have, however, I've seen several... There was actually an interview he gave with Playboy that I found really... interesting. I think it's like a famous one because they used to do think pieces and interview like famous people, and I remember somebody sent me that, and I found like some really interesting points there. I've seen fragments and excerpts. I've never seriously read his books, but I know the whole medium is the message thing. I mean, that's more salient than ever, right? I mean, I referenced in one of the patron newsletters, the Freigeist Express, the David Bowie interview where he was talking about how the medium of the internet was going to change everything in terms of how media is consumed, where the creator and the listener are going to be so simpatico, is how he puts it. Like basically, he's predicting all of these developments that actually came to pass. People would be able to get sort of instant feedback from the audience, right? And directly from them. And then that was going to then shape the way that, for example, a musician makes their music. They're no longer making music where you steal away to some castle, if you're Pink Floyd or something in the 70s, and isolate yourself and make this crazy artistic record that just comes out of your own mind. But you're releasing now singles on a digital platform that's immediately distributed to the whole world. People can click on it and listen to it within a second of it going up. And within a second of them listening to it, they can leave comments and tell the artist their feedback and what they should have done and what the parts of the song that sucked or how their last single was better, any number of things. And we see how this affects, say, film franchises, like Star Wars as the big crash and burn example, right? Disney acquires Star Wars, and what do they want to do? Well, it's no longer George Lucas who's just one guy, for better or for worse. He made the original series of Star Wars, the original trilogy. He also made the prequels. But for better or for worse, it's all him in some sense. Well, a lot of the original trilogy is actually contributions from other people. Really made it what it was. People give Lucas a little too much credit. Nevertheless, he's a visionary. He directed the first film. He produces all the others. He wrote and directed the first film. And, definitely the mind behind that whole project. Sometimes you can misfire. Sometimes things can, when you're an individual creative, you can make something that's perhaps weird or goes off in a direction the audience wasn't expecting, or you can have your own missteps, but it's ultimately your own creative product, right? Whereas Disney acquires it and they're thinking like from the business angle. They're thinking from the angle of the culture industry, what Adorno talks about. They're thinking about this is a cultural product. We paid a lot of money for this product. So we need to make a lot of money on it. How do you make a lot of money in your product in the culture industry? You give people what they want, give the audience what they want. What does the audience want, right? Well, now we're in that simpatico phase, as Bowie saw it, where the audience is giving you real-time feedback on every film to a degree that it wasn't possible before. The level of commentary that's not just coming from critics who are a select group of people, but from the whole populace. Anyone can start a YouTube channel and complain about Star Wars, right? And they effectively let audience feedback completely derail their trilogy of films, where they were constantly in reaction to their own audience. Like, oh, you didn't like the prequels? It's all CGI? The new movie is going to be like exactly like the original movies. And we're going to do all the practical effects that you like. Everyone was kind of like, well, that was just a soft reboot of the first movie. There's nothing original. And they're like, oh, you want something original? We're going to hire this guy, Rian Johnson. He's going to subvert everything you thought you wanted. And everyone's like, I hate this. It feels like Star Wars is dead. It's like he basically betrayed all of the core themes. And they're like, okay, you want to go back to all the core themes? Like, let's try and bring back all these old characters and have this like shit show of whatever the last episode was. I mean, that was just a fever dream. And it's all just like characters moving from A to B and excuses to have cameos from characters from the original movies. And I don't know. I'm sorry I went off in a long Star Wars digression, but it's like that was in my mind, that's an example of maybe one of the pitfalls of modern mediums of transmitting culture that have made maybe the audience and the creator too simpatico. Where if you're thinking just strictly about like giving the audience what they want, there's that great line. God, who said that line? That the audience doesn't know what they want. If they knew what they wanted, they would be the artist and not the audience. So if you do the whole thing based on giving the audience what they think they want, you're going to make crap. You're going to make the cinematic equivalent of junk food. And the same can happen with music. On the one hand, there have been all of these benefits to the new medium. But to the extent that the medium is actually shaping the message, that's probably been like where the worst effects have happened. Because we can kind of just go down the list of the pros and cons of like the internet and like, oh, well, everyone has access to the ability to distribute their music now. Okay, but look at how music's distributed. It's kind of destroyed the album form. This was a lot of Adorno's problem with jazz, by the way. Like, he felt that jazz exemplified the new medium of radio. The fact that jazz is now the popular genre. We think of jazz as like it's totally spontaneous and creative and solos, and they break all the rules. Speaking as someone who loves jazz, that's not true. Adorno points this out, and people like make fun of this point, like he doesn't know what he's talking about. But, we're not talking about, people immediately think about like free jazz, experimental jazz. That's never been popular. What Adorno was talking about was jazz as a popular style of music, a new genre that was broadly popular. Can you find all sorts of weird experimental things in any genre? Yes, but what is it that gets played on the radio? That was his real focus, guys, is the radio as a means. It's like, what is it there to do? Well, it's there to have ads, right? The public airwaves, what do they run on? They run on ads for products. So jazz songs are being used to sell soap and cigarettes, or other radios indeed. And the whole idea that, what music used to be were these compositions you sort of create as a total piece of art, from the start to the finish. It's not just a series of riffs. It's not repeating riffs and chord progressions. These are sort of aspects of folk music in many ways. But if you listen to a lot of modern jazz, you really only have 2 to 3 parts per song usually, maybe a couple of little transition parts. The underlying basis of these songs is not terribly complicated. It's in the solos, the virtuosity. That's where people are sort of expressing themselves and breaking all the musical rules. But ultimately, go listen to Miles Davis, So What? It's got that part, da-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, so what? That's not the actual line, but that's what it's supposed to sound like, right? And then it modulates up a little bit, and then it goes to a solo section. Go through all the solos, everyone plays their solos. There's not that many underlying riffs in the song. It's not like the song is this like long Wagnerian piece or something like that. You do what all musicians do. You set a chord progression, you jam on it. You might have an A riff and a B riff, and you might have maybe even a C riff and some transitions, but it's not... They're repeating riffs at the end of the day. And most modern jazz, the jazz that was really popular when the radio was booming, Adorno thought it was no coincidence. Jazz is becoming this really popular genre because there are these songs that are ultimately shorter than classical pieces. They're easier to digest. It requires less of the listener. You can just passively listen to jazz. And ultimately, it's not really... People try to extrapolate this into like Adorno being racist, or like Adorno just not understanding the genre. And it's like, no, I think he did understand. In comparison to modern pop music, jazz seems more creative and free and spontaneous. But in comparison to what came before jazz, it seems more formulaic. And really, the modern jazz songs were the first pop songs in the 30s and 40s and 50s. All of these crooners. By the way, I love a lot of this style of music, by the way. But it is very formulaic. It's the basis of the A, B bridge back to B, the chorus formula, is a lot of these modern jazz songs. And you have some solos in there, and you have some people who can hit some blue notes, right? It's syncopated. But at the end of the day, it's it lends itself to the possibility for mass production and mass consumption. It's the perfect form of art. Like, he didn't see this distinction between, well, jazz just happens to be on the radio. It just so happens that jazz becomes popular when we're trying to turn music into a cultural industry product that's commodified and used to sell soap. That's not an accident. That's why, and that in the future, it's not just the problem is with jazz. The problem for Adorno is like music is going to increasingly be this way, where it's not about a total work of art. It's about individual melodic or harmonic relationships that sound cool or pull an emotion out of you. Oh, that's a good hook. That's all you need, right? And that's modern pop music. And now it's become even more like individually commodified. Where now we don't have to put out albums. You put out a single, you download it off Spotify. The album form is kind of gone. So the total work of art is even more dissolved. And it's just the newest single, which is what? Totally formulaic. Totally, all of pop music is like trying to sound like each other and trying to just hone this craft of a series of formulaic artistic rules, essentially, that they follow, that are giving the audience what they want. But everyone looks around and is kind of like, wow, it feels like we're in an age of slop, being given what we want all the time. And so I don't know. I don't know if I did a good job of explaining what Adorno was saying. I guess my key points would be there are formulaic elements to jazz. There are elements that herald the modern pop song, and there are aspects of it that, to go back to your question with Marshall McLuhan, have to do with the medium. And we can see how the medium has affected every single genre of art. Ultimately, it's slopified it, is the unfortunate thing. That's the unfortunate problem. For all of the benefits seem to be kind of like ancillary, whereas the slopification seems to be like essential to the medium that we're using, if that makes sense. A medium like Spotify, I would expect, would incline towards slop, unfortunately, because it's very, you're, as an artist, you're trying to catch ears, right? And so how do you do that? Through playlists. You want to get on these playlists that are curated. And then when people are listening to a playlist on shuffle of like 200 songs and your song comes up, they've just heard 20 songs they didn't remember. Why are they going to remember yours? So you can't think about things like a total work of art. You can't think about being creative or outside of the box. You have to think about, what is the hook? You have to think about this whole technique of honing your craft, the pop producer mentality, right? Which is totally a separate thing, a totally separate mindset from making art, frankly. It creates this like atomized little commodities of individual songs that people just pick up, and no one's making symphonies anymore. Even as I say that, guys, I know that's not true. No, that's not 100% true. I know there's still plenty of interest in older musical forms, and even in the genre I'm doing, I'm kind of, clinging on to several conventions of older musical styles that are perhaps relics of older mediums. So I know it's possible, but again, it's like the question is just about how the modern mediums and technology are impacting art, and that's what I would say. It's unfortunate, but having not read McLuhan, I tend to look at it through Adorno's lens of the culture industry, that art has become a product, and therefore, if you want to understand any of the developments of art within any given domain of art, try to understand it as a product. And then if you understand it as a product and you think like a business person, if you think like somebody running an industrial factory churning out art in that form, then many of the ways in which the technology and the medium has changed and has consequently changed art along with it will make perfect sense. Because, something like Spotify, as I already said, it's a great medium for incentivizing the creation of slop, but it's wonderful also, from another side, if you want to make a lot of money without paying artists. And so that's where we are. Okay, let's go to Dragush Kobaj. Hey, Keegan, many thanks for all that you do. I see an ever-recurring fascination with the ancients in all ages, a sentiment I, too, am familiar with. Given the work you are undertaking, your book, what are perhaps some elements which make the ancients so captivating? It's funny, I actually end on that note in my book of sort of turning the question back around to the audience and asking them, why do you find the ancients so interesting? Sort of presuming that they do if they're reading the book in the first place. And asking ourselves, given everything we've looked at with the ancients, why do we still find them so attractive? Why are we still so attracted to the ancient world? So part of this is just modern malaise. And I don't mean specifically a kind of malaise created in the modern age, but, almost every age has people who are dissatisfied with it. People who are looking around at whatever is current and saying, everything sucks now, and we believe it was better in the past. And I'm not one of those people. I don't believe in golden ages myself, but I'm not one of those people who thinks things never have declined or never improved. I think history is very obviously cyclical. I think very obviously, many times when we do stand at a vantage point and look back to the past and say things were better back then, it's entirely possible that it was better. Right? It's also possible that we're not understanding, many of the things about our age, which are, complete advantages over the ancients that we just take for granted. And I think, a perennial thing, or just something that we should always keep in mind. It is impossible to compare two ages in which people lived. It's impossible. What do I mean by that? Well, you can read all the books you want about what it was like to live in ancient Greece, either their own words or archaeological findings or whatever. None of that ever amounts to an actual subjective experience of what it was like to live during that time. People often compare modern times, what I've heard a lot, the discourse around feudal systems, The serfs, they had, no rights. They're property of this feudal lord, basically bound to the land. But they got way more days off than we did, and they lived as part of this community that was bound together, and everyone knew their place in society, and they had unshakable religious convictions, and they actually did far less work than we do in the modern day. And, the people lording it over them only showed up once a year to extract their grain and then left them to their own devices mostly. So was it really that bad? Getting fresh air and sunshine every day, tilling the fields. Sounds good to me, And it's like, yeah, it's possible that you would be happier in that environment. It's also possible that you have no fucking clue, like how much worse it could have been in many ways, right? And things you just take for granted, like, every fourth child not dying within a year of being born, or things of that nature, no antibiotics, things like that. Again, is life, is it just this utilitarian story of progress where new technology just automatically makes things better? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is it's impossible for you, knowing only, this is the thing too, right? All of us only know the age that we live in. So for you to really know what it would be like to live in, say, the Middle Ages or in Greek antiquity, you would have to not only know what it's like to live there, but not know any other age. You would have to effectively be born in that age with no point of comparison, right? That's what it's really like to live in an age. That's what it's actually like for human beings, because to our knowledge, people aren't time travelers who get to experience all sorts of different ages. You only know the age that you're born in. And then people make all these comparisons and contrasts with other ages about what it would be like to live there. But if you knew nothing else, maybe you would be happy in the Middle Ages. The other thing is, like, when we say you, well, would you be happier in the Middle Ages? Well, whoever you are is dependent on this whole series of factors of your parents and their genetics and where they met and where you grew up and how you were raised. If we pluck you out of that and put you in a different time, you would just be a different person. So it's impossible to ever compare ages. That's the point I'm trying to get at. It's a mere thought experiment that none of us have any reference for. We don't know what it's like subjectively to experience other ages. We can only speculate. And so usually what our picture of a previous age has to do with necessities in the present day, or impulses in the present day, or moral aims in the present day, more likely. Now, is that true of Nietzsche? It absolutely is, and a lot of that is what I show in the book. He's creating this war between modern and ancient. He despises modernity. He wants to destroy Christianity. He says, like all knights of knowledge, I am tolerant towards the men of the past of antiquity, but I have a sense of sickness when I look at the product of decadence that is the modern man. So, again, we shouldn't take that as authoritative. We should ask, why did Nietzsche think that? What was his purpose in sort of presenting this? And I've always argued, even on the podcast I've argued this, that what Nietzsche is trying to do is bring out a truth by means of contrast that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise. So we have our modern values, our Christian values. They are antithetical to the Greek values, not because the Greeks wanted to reverse Christian values, because, in fact, they predate the Christian values. The Christian values were created as a refutation of the ancient world. And a lot of why Nietzsche is engaged in this struggle is because people viewed the Greeks particularly as humanists, forerunners of the Enlightenment. Matthew Arnold called them apostles of equality, the bringers of sweetness and light, borrowing from Swift's phrase. This view of the Greeks as these heralds of Enlightenment values, this literary culture, these people who believed in reason and believed in the power of humanity to reshape the world and change things for the better, and advancement of society and all of these things. And Nietzsche says, no, fundamentally that does not describe the Greeks. To the extent that it does describe them, it's the later Greeks. It's the later Hellenism. It's the Hellenism that existed after Socrates and with the Alexandrian age. But the early Greeks, they're anti-reason, they're anti-knowledge in some ways. They're suspicious of truth. As Tiresias says, what a dreadful thing the knowledge of the truth can be when there's no help in truth. Oedipus seeks the truth. What does he get for it? Wouldn't it have been better for Oedipus not to know? You can read that as, if not the moral of the story, potentially something that you could extract from that, of like, oh wow, how terrible the truth can be. So that could be a potential Greek value. We see how they're against labor. They see labor as disgraceful. They don't see hard work as something that ennobles the soul. They don't see it as something that there's dignity in labor. No, they don't see that at all, really. It's labor is a disgrace. The laborer is in a disgraceful position in society. They're against pity. It's might be, might be something that you can indulge in every once in a while, but they see it as a sort of a dangerous emotion, and one that Aristotle says should be routinely purged, cathartically purged during the experience of tragedy. Nietzsche doesn't agree with that view, that that's what tragedy is, but he says there's it's interesting because he says, well, Aristotle says this. I don't agree with that as the purpose of tragedy, but the reason why Aristotle is grabbing for that explanation, that shows us how anti-pity the Greeks are, that they think it needs to be purged by voluntary discharges, right? So there are just so many aspects of what we would just take for granted as moral behavior. You should be truthful and upstanding. You shouldn't be a hypocrite. You should be willing to give reasons and explanations for the things you do. You shouldn't lie. You shouldn't, all of these things that the Greeks, it's much more, in some cases, ambiguous. Like Odysseus is kind of a liar. He's kind of a deceptive character while also being a hero. But in many cases, it's just the straight inverse of our own morality. Like Theognis of Megara is openly writing about how the poor people are disgraceful. Being poor makes you a worse person. Laboring and having to scrounge for your income, for your ability to survive, that makes you into a worse person in every way. And therefore he thanks the gods for his wealth, for removing him from the need to labor, which makes you better. So there's all these elements that's why the ancients are captivating to Nietzsche. There's a great line from Jakob Burckhardt where he says, "We see with the eyes of the Greeks and hear their phrases and use their phrases when we speak." That we've inherited our whole culture from the Hellenic Greek world. And yet, it is from the Christian perspective, from the Schopenhauerian Christian perspective, which characterizes Burckhardt, the Greek world is evil, right? So we've received, and Nietzsche even echoes this in We Philologists, where he says, there's a dreadful and evil background to our Western civilization. We've inherited our whole culture from the Greeks, but according to the Christian morality and the Enlightenment morality and the humanist morality, all of these modern ideas, the Greeks have to be regarded as evil because they're the very inverse of all of our moral views. So what would it mean for us to get the founding, the first spark, the fire that starts our civilization from these people who are basically evil according to the morality that we now hold? And that's why Nietzsche says we were always projecting things onto the Greeks, trying to make them into these humanists, trying to make them into, the virtuous pagans, when in fact they were nothing of the kind. Now, is this just because Nietzsche wants to smash Christianity and return to the Greek master morality? I don't think that's the case. There's a great passage also in We Philologists where he says, to overcome antiquity through our own deeds, that would be the task. Along with Christianity, antiquity will also be swept away. Which is very interesting, right? It's sort of like we only need to raise these values of antiquity and the master morality as a means to show by contrast what is weak and slavish and horrible, the ascetic ideal, ressentiment, the bad conscience, everything about modern morality that's so sick and needs to be overcome. Once we overcome it, in some sense, we don't need antiquity anymore. And that, in fact, it's only, he says repeatedly, it's only through the works of artists, people like Goethe, who didn't even really understand paganism and the Greeks, right? He thinks Goethe fundamentally just kind of had Winckelmann's understanding of the Greeks, which was not really true. It just sort of sees them as an Edenic people, a purer, sort of a noble savage view of the Greeks, right? And Nietzsche says that, for all that, though, he took his love of the Greeks and turned it into great works of art. So it's justified. Doesn't matter if he was wrong, in some sense. Out of all the people who misinterpret the Greeks, Goethe kind of gets a free pass because he did something, right, with the Greeks. He took it and created great works. That's what we have to do. We have to overcome antiquity through our own deeds. That's the task. And I don't know if that really... what are some elements which make the ancients so captivating? I can't say what makes them captivating in general, because as I already mentioned, like the German Romantics were captivated by them because, for totally different reasons than Nietzsche, they saw them as, again, like this sort of Arcadian Eden. And then you have humanists like Renaissance humanists who are attracted to the ancients because In the case of Rome, that's the last time Italy ruled the Holy Roman Empire, just the Roman Empire. Now, the current iteration of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, is ruled by these Germanics, and we Italians don't have as much power. The good old days were the days of liberty and the days of prosperity for Italy were the Roman empires. So that's what they see in ancient Rome, at least, and maybe drawing some parallels between the Greek city-states and the Italian city-states as well. And, then people like Matthew Arnold or like the English romantic neo-pagans basically see like kind of a Rousseauian view of the ancient Greeks. Like they're just a people who are more moral than us, not because morality in the Enlightenment sense was always seen to advance and get better. Their view was like, no, modern society, it's very Rousseauian. It's like, no, it's ruined us. It's made us, that's what's given us a capacity for injustice and exploitation of our fellow man, and it's responsible for the all sorts of taboos on sexuality and shame around sexuality that the man before Christianity would never have held. And there's Comte de Volney, who sees all religions as sort of like a long decline from these original attempts to understand nature, and that the sort of ancient civilizations would have had a more pure religion before these priests came in and used it to justify the reign of state authority and things like that. So there's been so many interpretations of the ancients. You can look at where the context of Swift talking about the ancients bringing sweetness and light, and the Battle of the Books, which is a commentary on the ancients and moderns, right? So that there was like a whole discourse or disputation there in France. Is our modern age more enlightened, or will we never surpass Virgil and Ovid and all of these other people? For them, the ancients, quote unquote, were just Virgil, Ovid, Homer, which is probably why they interpreted the Greek civilization as a forerunner to the Enlightenment. So in any case, that's kind of what I'm getting at. What are some elements which make the ancients so captivating? Basically anything you can think of, somebody's projected it onto the Greeks. It's with Nietzsche that I think we get actually a rather sober understanding of who the Greeks were, how they were fundamentally violent, fundamentally didn't believe in equality, fundamentally anti-pity, anti-truth, to put it bluntly and perhaps in an oversimplified way. And I don't think it's because he just simple-mindedly wanted to go back to that. He says explicitly the conditions are different. Antiquity wouldn't survive modernity. So there's just all these fantasies about grafting modernity and its values onto the modern day, or fantasies about literally being able to go back and live in those ages. Really, everything that we say about the Greeks is something that we're saying about ourselves and the way we feel about modernity. I think Nietzsche realized that, and he was trying to use the ancients to bring out some particular things that he wanted to show by the light of contrast about modernity that he hoped we could overcome. Hopefully that answers your question, Dragoosh. Thank you very much. Next we have Fomorian Sleeper Agent. Have you read the Nietzsche on Freedom and Autonomy edited collection of essays? Encountered this recently and thought they each had a fascinating discussion of Nietzsche's approach to free will. How do you interpret his treatment of agency and the sovereign individual in relation to his concept of the drives? I have not read that collection. I guess I will put it on my radar. Agency. That's one of those concepts like freedom of the will, when you just state it in its fully articulated form as a phrase. I'm not going to say it's meaningless, but I think it's very hard to attribute a meaning to agency that doesn't end up redefining fundamentally what most people mean when they invoke the concept of agency as regards the freedom of the will, right? So Nietzsche does have a concept of agency, I guess. He has a concept of freedom. Paul Katsafanis points this out insofar as it has to do with your actions and we might say your moral aims or your drives being in some sense in harmony or unity with one another, where you're not acting against what it is you believe, we might say. So there's not this notion of a kind of autonomy insofar as you have the ability to have acted differently in any given case of an action that you take or a decision that you make. You could have chosen something else. It's not so much that concept. It's more the concept that, because it might be within Nietzsche's philosophy that perhaps you don't have a choice. Like maybe you're the kind of person where your fate is to always feel as if you're at war with your own drives, whereas your fate is to always feel as if the beliefs that you hold are not being properly manifested in your actions. And that sucks, but that might be. There are many people who live their lives like that. But when Nietzsche talks about sovereignty, he's often talking about the ability to command, or the ability to obey. We might say that he who commands is in some sense the most practiced at obeying. See, this is the way I would put it. I don't think drives leave any room for any of the conventional understanding of free will, and so I just simply say that Nietzsche is a fatalist. I don't think it's really useful to try and thread this needle, this compatibilist needle, where we fundamentally redefine what freedom of the will means. Which, when people are talking about freedom of the will, they really do mean, I think, what they really are getting at is the idea that you could have done differently than you actually did in any given circumstance, right? That you have this arbitrary ability to just sort of revoke all of the ruling impulses that comprise you, all of the previous events and memories and upbringing that shaped you, and just make an autonomous decision to do something differently. Whereas I think the Nietzschean picture that he gives us is fundamentally one in which you would make the same decision if you're placed in the same situation at the same point in your life. You would make the same decision every single time. So, I mean, if you want the short answer, his concept of the drives, I think, dispenses with the sovereign individual. The individual is not sovereign. We're not even individual. Individual being like something that can't be divided. We can be further divided. Right? We're divisible. We're divisible into all of these competing drives, and it's not one ruling mind or reason that governs all of it and decides which drive to fulfill or to honor. The drives are in competition with each other, and then reason follows from the triumphant drives. The reason will speak in the language of the triumphant drive. The self is kind of like a synthesis. It's a weaving together of all of these rather disparate and non-identical things, right? And so the sovereign individual, where does that play into it, right? What Nietzsche is typically talking about when he talks about somebody like Goethe, somebody who created himself, somebody who has brought their life into a full artistic pattern of their own making, is being able to sort of manage the relations between those drives and make their tension into one which is productive, manage them into a productive way. But I wouldn't get the wrong idea about that, as if Nietzsche thinks Goethe was able to use the mind's sovereign reason to affect that ordering. Goethe was simply the type of person who was able to bring that about. So, yeah, I mean, just personally speaking, I find concepts like agency and the sovereign individual to be just little more than that, concepts, right? I see very little in the way of anything concrete or anything that can be pointed to in the real world to justify these concepts. And oftentimes, as Nietzsche himself points out, these concepts were created for a purpose. We don't just naturally receive a ready-made order that tells us how the world is. Oh, you're a sovereign individual within this world that has agency. We receive that idea from the community so that it has the right to punish individuals and hold them responsible. That's what Nietzsche says, right? So, I think I'd be very interested in what people would have to say in these essays, but I would guess to the extent that people are going to invoke the ideas of free will in conjunction with Nietzsche's work, it's usually in a way in which freedom is redefined from the way that it's normally spoken of in the context of the free will debate. That's at least my opinion. Again, I haven't read this collection, so I'll have to look into it. My reading of Nietzsche is he's not a free will advocate. He's not a compatibilist. He's not even a determinist because he doesn't believe in causality. So your will can't even cause anything. The will is a fiction, right? There's no will that can be free. It's only these drives, these non-identical drives that we narrate this whole story about, where perhaps something like the sovereign individual comes in as a sort of artistic simplification. But even that was driven by social needs and the demand of the community to be able to punish. So that's my reading of Nietzsche on that issue. Thank you for the question. Next from Boar44. To what extent do you think Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy is an attempt to create a new religion? I don't think he intended his philosophy to be spread in a universalist way like Christianity or Islam, but for me it is difficult to interpret the overman or eternal return as something other than a quasi-religious doctrine intended to motivate people to live dangerously. Follow-up question, would someone who truly affirms life even need such things to motivate them? Thank you for the question. I've touched on this before. I think there is a certain interpretation of what Nietzsche's doing, especially in Zarathustra, that is giving us a new religion. I quoted earlier from Nietzsche saying, I don't want to be the saint of a new religion. I don't want to be turned into a new doctrine. And I think that gets at sort of the caveat you gave. He doesn't want his philosophy to become this universalist dogmatism. It's not Christianity or Islam because it's not for the whole world in some sense. And the core part of the religion is the repudiation of the teacher, right? And this experimental, this living dangerously, this kind of approach to life, which sort of, it can't include any sort of universal prescriptions of how to live. And yet what you see here, I think, is fundamentally correct. I think the way I often put it is a new mythology. And what he's doing is taking many of the functions that were fulfilled by Christian mythology, and he's swapping in new images and symbols, such as the Overman or the Eternal Return, new concepts that perhaps provide the same functional utility that those religions did, but are aimed at fundamentally different values. And in many ways, if we want to relate the question back to the ancient Greeks, in many ways are sort of like bringing some of the values of the ancient world into a new form. Right? It's not just, we can't just return to the worship of the Olympians. We need a new image like the Overman, which is frankly, more abstract. It is more philosophical. It requires more conceptual work from someone to understand it. It's not as simple as an image of, well, there are just these literal gods who live up in the sky or at the top of Mount Olympus and justify human life, right? They brought us forth and they justify our lives because they themselves live it. All of these things that Nietzsche says about the Olympians, the Overman is more of a concept, right? And it's because he's presenting this idea, or his intended audience for it are those of us who are post-Christian. It is to be taken in a more perhaps rarefied, nuanced, again, conceptual form. I don't think he's expecting us to take it as just the object of a new worship. Like we're going to start temples to the Overman. We're going to do literal animal sacrifices and pour out libations to the Overman. I don't think that's really the vibe. But, I think, so yes, the answer is yes. I think you basically nail it with your sort of the operating premises of your question. As for your follow-up, would someone who truly affirms life even need such things to motivate them? I mean, no, I guess not. Right? And then it's like, why did Nietzsche write the book, right? Why did Bodhidharma come from India to China? That was a big question in the Zen tradition. Because if there's nothing to teach, if there's no teacher, there's no Zen teachers. Zen can't be taught, right? And you can't get it from words or sutras. And there's no one to save and nothing to be saved from. There's no distinction between the enlightened and the unenlightened person. Then why did Bodhidharma travel to bring his doctrine, to proselytize his doctrine from going on this dangerous journey from another country? Why would you go and found this new religion if fundamentally your claim is that no one needs the religion? Zen has, they've gotten all sorts of ink. They've spilled all sorts of ink and extracted pages and pages of commentary and debates on these topics. And surely us Nietzscheans could do the same thing. I guess maybe then my approach would be to say, unask the question. Maybe it's the wrong question to ask. Would someone who truly affirms life need these things? Well, what do you mean by need? We get all sorts of inspiration from all over the place in our lives. You might read a great work, like a great work of literature, where there's a character that in some way inspires you. Or there's a word of dialogue in, say, a Greek tragedy that changes your whole view of things. And again, gives you some kind of inspiration or leads you to something else, right? And did you need to encounter that specific thing in order to have the inspiration? I mean, probably not. Maybe you would have gotten it from somewhere else, or maybe you're just that type of person. Nietzsche is just sort of sowing seeds, right? He's putting this out into the air. He's hoping that some of the people who are would-be free spirits will encounter his work, and maybe it will, in an epigenetic way, flip something on for them. Maybe it could have come from somewhere else. The thing is, our culture is so suffused with so much slave moralism and so much life degradation. I don't know if he thinks, well, I need to write this work to completely just, somebody's going to pick this up and it'll reprogram their brain to be a life affirmer. I don't think it's like that. I think it's about taking one small step that Nietzsche himself can take of sowing more life affirmation into the culture so that there's more opportunities for people who might otherwise, in a purely herd-oriented society, have ended up botched and badly turned out, can find some word of encouragement, some word that gives them inspiration. And it could come from anywhere, but maybe Nietzsche's provided us with yet another source of that. Maybe that's one way to look at it. Anyway, let's get on to Graham 17. He says, "Hi, Keegan. I know that you have been asked this before, but do you plan on covering the 1997 adaptation of Berserk? I really do recommend it." And Ian Savage commented to say he's already suggested this twice. I get comments asking me to cover Berserk. I won't say on every video that goes onto YouTube, but on quite a few of them, and from other channels as well. I get comments on Twitter where people say, hey, when are you going to talk about Berserk? I've said it in the past. I feel because of how many people are asking me about it, it's an inevitability that I'm going to have to talk about it someday. I'm just not really an anime guy, right? It's like you're asking me to go outside of the kind of normal things that I would watch or take in, which, when I have the time and when I feel the time is right, and I've covered so many of the other things that I want to cover, I guess I'll watch Berserk. I just can't promise you guys when it's going to be. So do I plan on covering it? Yeah, I suppose so. I don't know when, right? I'm sure eventually I am fated to have to talk about Berserk. But because the fact that so many people think that Berserk is like a really Nietzschean show, because I'm hearing that from all sides, kind of, it leads me to the conclusion, like, well, there has to be something there, right? There has to be something to this. So maybe I should watch it for that reason alone. But it is kind of scary, just to be honest, to lay bare, some of my inner thought process. So many people are going to be so excited and so interested in me talking about Berserk that, like, what if I watch it and I just, like, hate it and I don't like it at all? I'm going to end up angering a lot of my audience. And so, it puts me in a stressful situation, because anytime something's been hyped up and your audience really likes it, they really want you to like it, and I'm going to have to be honest with the audience, And so I really hope it works out. I hope I end up watching it, liking it, and draw those Nietzschean themes out of it, and hopefully have an episode that makes all of you happy. But I'd be doing it for you. Just keep that in mind. Don't say I don't have any aspect of the crucified in me, that I'm willing to do things for the sake of the community that I wouldn't normally do. Not that, I've watched some anime. I like classic anime and stuff like that. It's just not something that, it's not really part of my life now. I'm not an anime fan, really. But so we'll get there eventually. I don't know what else to say about that. I'm still making no promises about when, because it's on my radar. I'll say that. Sean Hart asks, how did the live course you led in the winter go? What did you like and not like? Did you feel like those attending got out of it what they were seeking? A connection with others, likely. Some opportunity for interaction and discussion. Do you think you'll do more in the future? I was tempted to join, but the time was not conducive here on the West Coast. Cheers. Thank you, Sean. I believe we've met. And yeah, I think we certainly have. Yeah, it's coming back to me. So it went great. It was... it was new territory, and it's different when you're lecturing in front of a live audience. I think some of the people did the Acid Rising courses as more like seminars or group discussions. I had a lot that I wanted to get out, and I was seeing it as an opportunity to really dig deeply into this one topic and to really flesh it out and give a comprehensive analysis. And So it was basically just like long lectures with a Q&A period. And it's like the hardest things about all that for me are the social aspect, or like directing a class discussion, getting people to actually ask questions, not being uncomfortable if people don't have anything to say or don't have any questions. A lot of the time people do have questions, but they don't want to like be the first one to ask something. There's all these like weird social dynamics, that I could just perceive, that I remember from when I was a student in school. You don't want to ask the question every single time. You don't want to everyone's trying to be nice and let other people have the time, and all these things. But at the end of the day, it was just 4 lectures with some Q&A, and everyone at the end of the course seemed to really have gotten something out of it and seemed to have really enjoyed it. It's nice to be able to discuss these things with a group who's also interested in it. As far as more in the future, yeah, probably. I mean, the thing is, they have a lot of lecturers working at that particular research commons, they call it. We have talked a little bit, like I might come back and do another one in the future. It'll probably be next year. I have put feelers out, of maybe doing another sort of course or something like that at another group. Para-academia, there's all sorts of opportunities now. But I don't really have any news on that at the moment. There was kind of an opportunity I was talking with someone else about, but I don't know if it's actually going to happen. I mean, I had a lot of fun. If that was the only time I ever did that, I would consider it a great success. And it was in many ways similar to the podcast, but different. The parts of all of these things that are always the hardest part for me are, again, managing like people, not managing like as a manager. You know what I'm saying? Managing social interaction and logistics and dealing with people's issues where they're unable to view some part of the web interface of the course, and getting people their reading materials, and trying to, there's just all these logistical things, and the social aspect of teaching in that way that was different. It would be very interesting. I don't know what it would be like to teach and lecture in a room in front of like a live like group of students. I feel like that would be a different environment. And that could be kind of interesting. Overall, I found it a positive experience. Everyone else seemed to really enjoy it. And the materials, the lecture materials, the written versions that I've constructed out of those lectures, I'm going to take some of the ideas of the presentations of those ideas. They'll probably find their way into a written work in the future. So it was useful for me to get me to think through some things. And so I'll probably do it again. Had a great experience. Yeah, that's just about it. Thank you very much, Sean. Robert Sullivan, Nietzsche claims that God is dead and we have killed him. What is your list of the means by which this murder was done? Well, the former pope who retired said that he choked on his all too great pity. The ugliest man, I'm not sure how he says how he assassinated God. I always imagined with a knife, right? How else? I get the impression it's kind of a joke question in some ways. But yeah, those are the characters that bring up the actual circumstances of the death of God. I mean, the madman does say, "Who will wash the blood off of our knives?" So we can imagine a kind of like Caesarian style, like Brutus and Cassius leading the assassins to stab Caesar to death in the Senate. We all surrounded God with knives and stabbed him, and maybe that was how it was done. More likely though. It's more, there's a common trope in a lot of fantasy novels, or I think in Terry Pratchett and Discworld, this is the case, where the gods literally draw their life force off of the fact that people believe in them. And I sort of more imagine God just slowly, like we imagine the Leonardo da Vinci version of God, the white-bearded old man, the father, right, the universal father, up in the sky, Jupiter, right? Sky Father, the literal meaning. I imagine the Sky Father just sort of slowly fading, becoming like a ghostly image as more and more people turn away from him, avert their eyes onto other things or new images of the divine, like science or whatever the case may be. And slowly he just becomes thinner and thinner, and until his image entirely disappears, dissolves into the wind. And because no one believes anymore, everyone's looked away. Their attention's no longer on that God. It no longer has the power to condense our focus, possess us, It's just sort of like a nice historical or anthropological fact that people used to believe in these sky fathers. So that's my vision of it, Robert. Thank you for the question. And we now have one final question from Victor Stromberg. Hey, Keegan, when Nietzsche spoke of master-slave morality, was the thought simply regarding a collective or the interpersonal or even intrapersonal? Thinking of a provider versus providee, for instance, in an interpersonal setting, one could imagine that it would subvert the expectations of many if, for instance, the provider is a rich entrepreneur providing for a relative or other person of interest through a trust fund. In that case, it would seem like the master-slave morality is rather kept within mental bounds than a concrete social construct, as in the titular, and the positions have thus been reversed, opposite to the popular consciousness. Do you think it makes sense to look at master-slave morality from such a standpoint? Cheers from Sweden, Victor. So it seems like what you're asking, I may not have this entirely right, I'm not sure I fully understand, but that it seems like the rich entrepreneur who takes care of somebody through a trust fund, that person isn't physically bound to him as a master, the providee, right? It's sort of a mental thing, like where the person who provides for them is sort of perhaps mentally thinks like, okay, this person has to do whatever I want, or they have to appease me, or I'll cut them off. I mean, there still is a very real incentive there, right? That's not just mental, right? If that other person can't survive without this rich entrepreneur, then that would be a coercive relationship still. But I can still imagine how there might be more of a mental aspect of it. It's certainly not the case that person can't abandon let's just use a more honest example, right? I feel like a more real world example would be like a rich husband or a rich wife taking care of their spouse. And that person might not love them, but they feel like they can't leave, right? Because what will my life be? I'll be thrown out onto the streets. Maybe that wouldn't be the case in California where you get alimony or whatever, but here in Texas, there's no alimony. I guess you split the estate 50-50. I guess it depends on where you're from, but in general, people don't want to throw their lives into upheaval, and especially if you do something like have an affair, that could affect your ability to get anything out of the divorce settlement, right? So it's a messy process, and we could see a situation where someone is like a kept woman, or in our modern times, even a kept husband, right? Who just has uncertainty about their future. That maybe they don't love their partner, but it would be such a messy process, and maybe they'll come off worse for it if they were to get divorced. And so maybe somebody stays in a subpar relationship and feels as though they have to be deferential to the breadwinner in the couple. I feel like that's a very straightforward situation to imagine, where someone's bonds to someone else are based on material sort of incentives, but they're also mental, like no one's forcing them to stay in the marriage. It's not like medieval times where you can't get divorced, right? Where that's unheard of. It's where you're just, you're sort of like that that line by Fleetwood Mac, right? In Landslide, I've been afraid of changing because I built my life around you. That kind of thing. And maybe finds himself in even a deferential position. That would be a very different situation than the master-slave morality, I guess, is like, I don't know if I would map master-slave morality onto that. I think insofar as the master-slave morality is brought up, it's being brought up as a very real historical situation in which we're talking about actual power and ownership over other human beings' lives. Like, you are an object, the master can kill you, he could do whatever he wants to you, right? Very different situation, someone just being provided for in a maybe unequal sort of relationship does not hold a candle to the position of the Roman master versus the Roman slave. They're so different in terms of like just quantitative issue, like just the amount of power the master has over the slave. If we want to quantify it, the amount is so much greater, but it's such a vast difference that it pushes it into a different, just qualitatively a different situation. I don't think we should extract the master and slave morality from literal slavery and try and map it on. This is the cause of so many pitfalls of interpretation, because people look at that and they say, isn't the resentment of the lower classes today kind of like slave morality? Isn't wokeism slave morality? Isn't Trumpism slave morality? Isn't this resentful? Isn't that resentful? Blah, blah, blah. To the extent master and slave moralities are a useful thing to abstract, to extract from their context and turn into abstract concepts that we can then map onto things in any age, I think the most useful framework for that is Deleuze's active and reactive. The master is active and affirmative. The glance at the slave is simply the pleasure of knowing oneself different. This is all in Nietzsche, by the way. It's one of Deleuze's most honest, sober interpretations of Nietzsche that isn't going off in his own Deleuzian direction. But that's the most important thing to me, is insofar as Nietzsche talks about the master as one who legislates values out of his own will. That has, the noble soul has reverence for itself. It's entirely self-facing and self-directed. Whereas the slave morality is based on fear of the other, it's other-directed, it's about safety from the thing that causes you fear, and then ressentiment towards whatever it is that causes you fear, causes you harm, or just hurts you in some way and you can't get back at them. It's an other-directed morality, and therefore a reactive morality, and therefore one that's it's constantly caught up in this sort of, well, I mean, from Deleuze's perspective, it gets caught up in the Hegelian dialectic, for example. But that is the more important point to me, is that what Deleuze is pulling out of the master and slave morality is this kind of psychological description of certain thought patterns that we can comprehend outside of any social relation that exists, right? Where he says we shouldn't really, when we're looking at it on this level, Deleuze doesn't put it this way. He thinks basically this is the true meaning of the master and slave morality. I think it's just one potential reading, but it's a really useful one. If we look at these as psychological sort of patterns or something like that, there's like the master thought pattern and the slave thought pattern as psychological sorts of ways of thinking. Either you're caught up, trapped in ressentiment caused by these traces of past slights towards you or something like that, which then you require some outlet for ressentiment. And the priest, of course, loops it back into you and creates this dismal workshop of guilt. So that's one system. And then you have simply the self-affirmative soul that has reverence for itself and says, what is good is what I say is good because I am the legislator, because I justify it out of my own will. We could say that that's a far more rare, I mean, we would say it's healthy, but it's not normal in the sense of ordinary, right? It's healthy in the sense of a kind of great health or superordinate health, to the point where we could even wonder, did that ever even exist, or is this just a kind of psychohistorical myth? Was there ever anyone so active and affirmative as the master, who truly did just see his enemies as a chance to test himself in battle, with no resentment for them at all, no desire to take revenge, even willing to tolerate his parasites, say, what are my parasites to me? May they live and flourish. I'm strong enough for that. It's all about my own strength, and that's all I care about. I just want to affirmatively do something in this world. Has that ever existed? Maybe, maybe not. But, to the extent that we want to pull a psychological type or a certain way of thinking out of the master and slave morality and abstract it, that's what you get out of the master, is this almost superhuman sort of style of living and valuing in the world, versus the slave morality, which unfortunately seems to characterize how most people think and value and operate. But if you want to look at them as like relating to a concrete social relationship, I don't think it maps on to anything other than the actual master and the slave. And I guess I'll say one final point before I end the Q&A. This is another thing I brought up with the living philosophy. There's an incredibly important passage in Nietzsche's Genealogy where he says, and I believe it's an essay too, I read the entire quote on the discussion with the living philosophy, and it's going to be in my essay, or it might turn into a book on Ubermodernism, but where Nietzsche is talking about how there is a sign chain of subjugations that regards anything, right? We could also say interpretations, but he says every interpretation is the will to power triumphing and subjugating something to its own purposes. And when he says something, he specifically says an organ, a social institution, an idea. It could really be anything. All of these aspects of human life, we're always interpreting and reinterpreting according to the needs of the moment. And there's this way of trying to understand, for example, the function of something like punishment. Nietzsche says these moral genealogists, these English psychologists, they say we must have developed punishment with the intention of punishing, right? The eye was made to see, the hand was made to grasp. He says, well, no, that's not actually how things work. The origin of a thing and the function it's serving now don't necessarily have anything to do with one another. Oftentimes the origin, the original function something was serving is very different from today. You shouldn't try to understand morality as just these evolutionary adaptations that made us better at being social organisms, because that's you retroactively projecting our values now onto the whole development and saying, well, this was the end. This was the telos. This is what it all developed for, is what we understand this thing to be now. And therefore, everything in the past will be interpreted through that lens. Nietzsche says no. In a very important way, genealogy of morals is an intervention into these simple-minded genealogies, which draw a neat lineage from one thing to another and think it's explained thereby. So in this specific point, the master and slave morality, one of the things I emphasize in that conversation, which I think is of chief importance, yes, Nietzsche is drawing this dual descent of our modern morality. She says can exist even in the same soul, by the way. So it's not as simple as there's slaves and masters walking around today. We're all both at the same time, maybe in different proportions, maybe in different degrees, but different combinations. But ultimately, we inherit both moralities. But even more important than that is the fact that what the slave morality means for the Roman slave is different from what it means for the Teutonic barbarian, and it's different from what it means to the priest and the priestly class. And that's different from what it means to the scientific positivist or the empirical utilitarian or any number of forms of morality that we can draw a lineage from slave morality to today. And so the point here is that the differences are actually more important than drawing this lineage where you say, well, it's all the same thing. It's all slave morality, just taking different forms. No, the differences in the form in which it manifests is where all the action is in Nietzsche's philosophy. When the priest harnesses slave morality, it becomes a new power for him, whereas for the slave, it's a kind of imaginary revenge in the social system. So it has a very different sense. For the Teutonic barbarians who take up Christianity and then found Christendom, right? For them, the slave morality becomes primarily a source of guilt. One of the things Deleuze says, the importance isn't that Nietzsche connected ressentiment to the bad conscience, but that he drew a distinction between them. They're very different things, right? They may have guilt, and the bad conscience may come from this origin of having to deal with ressentiment, but they're fundamentally different mental patterns or thought patterns. And or we might even say impulsive patterns, just psychological patterns. I don't want to imply that they're just like ways of thinking. They're also ways of feeling, and they're also referred to the types of drives that are manifesting in thinking. And so there's this sine chain of subjugations, right? You can read the history of how we think about ideas or moralities or things or institutions or organs or anything as a long history of different interpretations, all of which referred to the needs of the present moment at that time. And it's not this neat genealogical chain. And so the slave morality has meant many different things. It's been interpreted in many different ways. It's taken many different forms. It still, therefore, has a meaning as a concept. It's still, therefore, important. But I think trying to neatly map it onto the present day and say, oh, Nietzsche was so right. There's all these slave moralists who are exactly the same as the Roman Christians or something like that. When the social institutions and material relationships and the cultural background is all so different after 2,000 years of Christianity, right? It's easy enough to just call the Christians slave moralists and ignore how much gunk has been accreted to the ideology of Christianity that comes from outside of, the slave moralism of first century apostolic Christianity. We've had 2,000 years for all sorts of Christian ideologies and competing interpretations to develop. Anyone says, oh, well, the slave morality is on the side of the left. It's like, well, the Roman slaves were taking an imaginary revenge because they didn't have the power to take revenge on their masters. That's why they were resentful. Does that really apply to like Russian revolutionaries under Lenin who did have the power to take revenge? Right. So they wouldn't be driven by resentment after that? Is that what we're going with here? Like, there's just, we need to stop trying to use Nietzsche's words as a blueprint. I'm not saying you're doing this. It feels to me like you are trying to grapple with difference, right? You're trying to grapple with, okay, there's these different situations. In what way can we apply Nietzsche's insights to different social situations today? And I would just say, be careful. Take a step back. don't try to do that in the way of like neatly mapping on a master and a slave. Remember that the master and the slave are both in the hearts of everyone involved, most likely, in any modern situation. And furthermore, that if you really want to use these as universal sort of psychological archetypes or something like that, you have to go down to that deeper level of active or reactive thought patterns, in which case either one of those people, of the provider versus the providee, might be animated by the slave morality or an affirmative master morality. We really don't know, right? It's particularity, it's difference that interests me more and more, less than these schemata for easily fitting things into categories. The older I get and the more I live, the less these categories interest me. All right, everybody, that's it. Thank you for joining me. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.